Everyone thinks a dragon woman sheds the way a snake does. One long pull on a warm morning, and out she steps, bright and new, and the old skin lies on the floor like a dropped coat. It takes 100 years. The old scale does not slide off anything. It dies where it sits, welds itself to the meat underneath, and for 100 years she is an animal on a chain that cannot stop screaming. I learned that on my second day in this world, in a stone room under the Vale House, when a man I had never met put a price on me out loud so the guards could hear it. 9 copper. He repeated it, because the first time nobody was listening. His name was Hask and he ran the scale yard down on Chainside. He had a wet mouth and a leather apron and a way of patting your shoulder while he sold you. 9 copper is what a scratcher costs in Brackhold. That is the whole price, once, for the whole man, and it is about what a decent goose goes for on Narrow Row. I had been alive in this body for about 30 hours. Long enough to learn my new name was Kess, that I had no family here worth mentioning, and that the previous owner of these hands had owed Hask money. Down the stairs. Down again. The air went from cold to warm to wet, and then it went to something else that I can only call old, the way a kettle smells when it has been boiled dry twice. There were 4 doors at the bottom and 3 of them were open. The 4th had a bar across it as thick as my thigh, and the bar had gouges in it, and the gouges were on the inside. Rules, from Hask. You do not talk to her. You do not look at her face. You go in, you scratch where she points, you come out when the bell rings. What if she speaks to me? Then you are lucky, because most of them stopped talking about 40 years ago. He lifted the bar. It took him and another man both, and the other man was called Piner and had a burn across his neck he did not explain. Here is what I saw. A room the size of a barn, floor sanded smooth, drains cut into it. Chains coming down out of the ceiling. And a woman. She was maybe 9 feet of her sitting down, folded up against the far wall with her knees near her chin, and her arms were wrapped around her shins, and she was not moving at all. Her back and her forearms were scale. Deep green, dulled over like a coin that has been in a pocket for years. The rest of her was a woman, tall, and the fingers on her were long enough to make you look twice at your own. The chains were not on her wrists. They were on rings driven into the wall behind her, and they hung slack, which meant she had not fought them today. They were not there to keep her in either. They were there so that the men outside would have something to pull. 81st year, from Hask, in the voice of a man giving you the weight of a sack. Vale House, the elder daughter. Do the shoulder and the left side of the back and do not touch the ridge. Then the door shut and the bar came down and I was alone with her. I would like to claim I was brave. I stood with my back on the door for a long time and I counted the drains. There were 6. There was old blood in 2 of them. Then, without lifting her head. Are you the new one? Her voice was cracked all the way through, like she had been shouting in a field for a week. Yes. Do you know how long the last one lasted? No. Neither do I. I stopped being able to count around the middle of the summer. I took a step. She did not move. I took another, and I saw her hands tighten on her own shins, and I understood the chains all over again. She was holding herself still with her own arms. What is your name? Ashaya of the House Vale. She stopped. Asha. Nobody has used it in a while. Then, do not stand behind me. If you stand behind me I will not hear you, and if I do not hear you I will move, and if I move you will be under it. So I came around the side, in the light of the one lamp, and I got my first proper look at what 100 years of this actually does. The old scale on her shoulder was lifted. Not off, lifted, the way a shingle lifts on a roof, one edge up and the rest of it welded down, and under the lifted edge there was a wet dark line where the new scale was trying to come in and could not, and all along that lifted edge somebody had been at it with an iron hook. I know a hook mark when I see one. There were dozens. Some of them were healed over into ridges, which meant they were years old, and some of them were fresh enough to still be weeping. Who did this? The pickers. Every spring my sister pays for pickers. 2 men, 3 days, they get the hook under the plate and they pull. And then I break something of theirs and they do not come back until spring. Does it help? She laughed. It was a terrible sound and I do not want to hear it again. Then, does it look like it helps? In my other life I worked in the scrub room of a bathhouse. 6 years of it. 2nd floor, past the cold plunge, a tile room with 2 benches and a drain in the middle and a window that never once opened. That is what I was. A man with a mitt and a bucket, who took the dead off strangers 20 minutes at a time, 10 hours a day, under a sign reading warm stone in letters somebody else had painted. I died in that building on an ordinary Thursday, and the last thing I heard was the boiler, and that is all of that. Here is the one thing that trade teaches you in the first month, and it took me 30 seconds in that cell to know that nobody in this world had ever learned it. You never pull. Dead skin does not want to come off dry. Dry, it is glued down and it takes the living with it, and it hurts, and it bleeds, and it grows back angrier and thicker than it was. Every apprentice figures that out by ruining somebody once. Wet, warm, softened, given time, the same dead sheet lifts away in one piece and takes nothing with it, and the person under it does not even feel the moment it goes. That is the whole secret. Heat, oil, patience, and the right angle. It is barely even a skill. It is a thing you learn from an old woman who slaps your wrist when you press too hard, and they had been going at a dragon with an iron hook for 80 years. Asha. How long has that shoulder been like that? She turned her head. That was the first time she looked at me, and her eyes were the color of a lamp behind a green bottle, and there was nothing in them but the itch. Why does that matter? Because I think I can take it off you. You cannot. Not all of it. That one plate, nobody takes it off. It comes off when it comes off. That is what shedding is. You wait and you go mad and one day it is over. I know. I am telling you I can take that one plate off today. She was quiet a long time. Then, very carefully, like a person setting down something full. If you are lying to me, I will not be able to help what I do next. Fair. Then, what do you need? I need hot water. As hot as they will carry. I need every lamp in this house and something to put them close. I need oil, any oil, lamp oil, kitchen oil, I do not care. And I need a brush. There is no brush. Then a broom head. Then horsehair. Then a scrub of straw with the sharp cut off it. Anything that is stiff and does not scratch. And how long? Hours. Not minutes. You are going to sit there and it is going to be boring and at some point you are going to think I am doing nothing at all. She put her head back against the stone. Boring, she repeated, in the voice of a woman being offered a country. Getting the water was the first fight and I lost most of it. Piner opened the door a hand's width. The bell has not rung. I gave him my list, and he waved me back down to scratch, so I used the only true thing I had. If I come out of here in an hour with nothing done, Hask has lost 9 copper and you have lost nothing. If I come out with a plate offer, he has a plate. That was the number that moved him, and it is the only number in this trade that has ever moved anybody. A whole plate. Nobody in Brackhold had ever seen one. What comes off a shedding dragon in the ordinary way is grit. Chips, splinters, wet crumbs, a bucket a season, and the yards down on chainside boil it and press it into cheap plate for cheap men, and Hask made his living on it. A whole plate, unbroken, from a live shed. There were 2 of those in the kingdom and both were on a wall in the capital and one of them was 300 years old and everybody knew whose it was. Piner went and got the water. They brought it in a copper pot that took 2 men, and they brought the oil in a jug meant for something else, and they gave me a horsehair brush that had last been used on a mule. I have worked with worse. I put 4 lamps on a stool and dragged the stool close until the shoulder was in the heat of them, and I soaked a folded cloth and laid it over the whole lifted plate, and I put my hand on it to hold the heat in, and then I did nothing for a very long time. She hated it. About 20 minutes in it got to her. You are not doing anything. I am doing the only part that matters. I could have had 2 men and a hook halfway through by now. You could have had 2 men and a hook halfway through your shoulder by now. She went quiet. I changed the cloth. The water in the pot went from too hot to hold to just warm, and Piner brought more without anybody sending him, which I noticed. When you steam a person, the dead layer drinks. It goes from bone dry to leather to something like a wet leaf. You can feel it happen under your palm. It is the most satisfying thing in the world and nobody has ever paid me for the opinion. Under the cloth, that dead plate went soft at the edges. Not soft like flesh. Soft like a fingernail that has been in the bath. Then I put oil on the lifted edge and worked it in with 2 fingers, back and forth, walking it under a hair at a time, the way you work oil into a seam. Asha. Does that hurt? No. Say if it does. It does not hurt. She sounded angry about it. It does not hurt and it should hurt. Everything there hurts. Why does it not hurt? Because I am not tearing anything. 2 hours. 2 hours of cloth, heat, oil, and the brush going in small circles at the edge, softening the join, letting the dead give up its grip on the living because dead things always do if you wait. Somewhere in the second hour she started talking. She talked at the wall more than at me. A horse she had owned called Little Bishop who bit everyone but her. She talked about a street called Marrow Row where the bread was good. She talked about her sister Ivian, who was younger by 90 years, and who had run the Vale House since the shed began, and who had married a man named Revanmar, and who came down here twice a year to look at her and did not come closer than the door. I kept working. That is the other thing the trade teaches you. When someone starts talking on the bench, you keep your hands moving and your mouth shut. Then the edge lifted under my thumb. Not the way it had been lifted, hooked up and angry. It came away like a page. Asha. Do not move. She did not move. I got the brush under it, flat, the whole width of it, and I ran it along the seam from the top of the shoulder down toward her spine, and the plate came up off her back in one sheet the size of a door in a small house. It made a sound I have not been able to lose since. It was the sound of a wet sheet being taken off a line, and underneath it there was new scale. Pale as a green apple, soft as the inside of a lip, laid in rows so perfect it looked drawn, and steaming faintly in the lamplight. Nothing bled. I stood there holding a plate of dragon scale as long as my body, and my arms were shaking, and my first thought was not about money and not about power. My first thought was that I had never seen anything that clean. Asha had not made a sound. Then, in a voice with nothing cracked in it at all. It stopped. What stopped? The itch. Under there. It stopped. She reached across herself, slow, like a woman reaching into a fire, and she put 2 fingers on the new scale, and then she put her whole palm on it, and then she made a noise I am not going to try to spell. 81 years. 81 years and 1 hand's width of me is quiet. We can do the rest. And how many hands wide am I, do you think? I looked at 9 feet of her, folded up in the dark, and I did the arithmetic, and I kept the number to myself, because it was not a kind number. It was hundreds. Then the bell rang, because the bell always rings at the wrong time, and Piner opened the door to inform me that my hour had ended 4 hours ago. He looked at me. He looked at the thing in my arms. Then he ran up the stairs shouting for Hask, and he did not shut the door behind him, and Asha and I looked at each other in the light coming down. Do not give them the method, and be quick about it. It came loose on its own. That is the story. Why? Because if it is luck they will send you back down. If it is a skill, they will sell you somewhere else by Friday. That was the first time anybody in this world gave me something for free, and it cost her nothing and it saved me a year. Hask came down at a run with his apron flapping and he took the plate out of my arms with both hands and held it up to the lamp, and his face did a thing I have seen exactly once before, on a man who has just been handed something he does not have a word for. He turned it over. He tapped it. He put his ear near it and tapped it again. Then, get out. What? Out of the cell, boy, out, do not touch it, do not breathe on it. He was laughing. He was actually laughing. Piner, the cart. The good cart. Not the one with the wheel. They took the plate up the stairs on a wool blanket like it was a body, and the 4 men who carried it kept saying hole, hole, look at it, hole, and somebody at the top of the stairs dropped a lamp and nobody stopped to pick it up. Nobody looked at Asha once. They barred the door with her behind it and they took the plate to the yard, and by the next morning it had been sold, and I heard the number the way you hear weather from another room. 420 gold, to a man from the armorers on Kettle Bridge whose name nobody in that yard bothered to tell me. 420 gold for 1 plate. And out of 420 gold, Hask gave me my supper, and called me a lucky little animal, and put 2 copper in my hand and closed my fingers over it himself so I would feel in doing it. 2 copper. I have read stories where a man in my position feels rage. I did not feel rage. I stood in the yard at Chainside with 2 coins in my fist and I felt like a bucket. I felt like a thing that had been used and set down. Then a girl came past with a barrow of scale grit and, without slowing, you should have hidden a corner of it. Her name was Belle. She was about 17 and had forearms like a rope maker, and her hands were the color of the lye she stood in all day, which is no color at all. Hidden a corner of what? They break. Everything that comes out of that cell comes out broken. So a corner goes missing and everybody agrees it broke off. That is how Ott ate for 2 winters. Who is Ott? She jerked her chin at the shed. The old one with the hand. What happened to his hand? The yard, she said, and did not stop walking, and that was as much as I got, and I would not get a better answer for another month. I slept that night in the drying shed under a tarpaulin that smelled like the inside of the kettle, and I lay awake, and I did the only useful thing I have ever been good at. I thought about tomorrow's shed. Because I knew one thing that nobody in Brackhold knew. When you take a dead layer off properly, the thing underneath does not just sit there. It finishes. It hardens, it tightens, it comes into itself in a day or two, because it was ready the whole time and the dead sheet was the only thing holding it back. They thought the 100 years was how long it takes new scale to grow. It is not. The new scale grows in a week. The 100 years is how long it takes a dead plate to fall off by itself when nobody helps it. They had the whole thing backwards, for 1,000 years, in every house in the country, and their daughters and their mothers went mad in cellars because of it. And in the morning, when they let me down there to sweep, I looked at the hand's width of pale green the first had uncovered, and it had gone dark and hard overnight, and when I put my thumbnail against it, it turned my nail. Asha was watching me do it. Try to break it. Her voice had gone very quiet. I hit it with the iron hook they had left on the floor. I hit it properly, twice, with my shoulder behind it. The hook rang. My arm went numb to the elbow. And on the new scale there was not a mark, not a scratch, not a dull spot, nothing. Then Asha put the sentence that changed everything into the smallest voice she had, because we both understood at the same moment what it meant. Cass. The old plate never did that anywhere on me, in 200 years of wearing it. Say that again. The new one is harder than the old one. And I stood in a cell in a house that was not mine, holding a hook that could not scratch a woman who had spent 81 years being called weak, and I finally understood what I had actually taken off her shoulder. Not a scab. A lock. The scale yard on Chainside woke up rich that morning and I woke up under a tarpaulin. That is just the shape of the thing, and you should see the shape early. Hask had a new coat by noon. He bought it off a rack outside Ferris the dyer, still damp, and he wore it wet because he could not wait, and by evening it had marked his neck blue and he did not care. He bought the yard 4 barrels of beer out of the Blue U. He bought Piner a knife with a stag horn grip off a peddler called Jeb Ordry. He paid off a debt he had with a woman named Sook who kept the ferry, and he did it in the street where people could watch him do it. And he put a man on the stairs to the cell so that nobody could go down. Including me. Especially me. Belle found me at the vats around the middle of the morning. She had a barrow of grit and a scarf over her mouth and she stood there looking at me like I was a sum she was checking. You slept in the drying shed. Yes. She thought about that. Then she pulled the scarf down. The drying shed has a stove that stays warm until about the 3rd hour, and I had been sleeping at the cold end of it like an idiot. The yard is worth a minute of your time, because the yard is what the whole trade sits on. Down on Chainside there were 9 vats, and each vat was a stone tub the size of a small room, and in each vat there was lion water and a great deal of stirring. That was the whole industry. What goes in is grit. Chips and crumbs and splinters of dead scale, the leavings of a shed, swept out of cellars all over the kingdom and sold by the sack to whoever will buy. You boil it soft. You press it between iron plates in a shed that a water carrier called Nun keeps wet all summer. You get a sheet the size of your hand, mottled and gray, and it will stop a knife but not a good one, and every second guard and every third carter in Brackhold has a jerkin sewn with it. Cheap armor for cheap men. 12 copper the sheet. Belle told me that number the way you tell somebody the day of the week, and every sack of that grit is somebody's grandmother, upstairs somewhere, going slowly out of her mind. Nobody at the yard put it like that. It was the spring pick, or a good house, or the Faro lot came in light this year. Ott was the only one who ever put it plain, and Ott was strange. Ott had one hand in about 60 years and a habit of talking to the vat instead of to you. He had been at Chainside since before Hask, and Hask was afraid of him in a small way that he covered with jokes. The hand went in the year of the bad batch. Somebody sold the yard a lot of wet grit that had been packed too fresh, and it took heat badly, and a vat went over. Light does not burn you the way fire does. It just keeps going. Ott stood in it for as long as it took 2 men to reach him, and it kept going after they got him out, and by the next week there was no saving anything below the wrist. He gave me all that while stirring with his good arm, and he did not once look at me, and at the end of it he mentioned that the man who sold the wet grit is a grandfather now on Marrow Row with a garden and a pear tree. Ott had a daughter. Her name was Hessa and she did not work in the yard, and I did not meet her for another month. The whole kingdom knows this and never says it aloud, and I had to have it explained to me twice because I kept assuming somebody would have solved it. Every great house in Brackhold has a cellar. In about a third of those cellars, at any time, there is a woman of that house in her shed. A shed comes once in 1,000 years. It runs 100. That means a house with a long line has one going most of the time, and while it goes, that house is holding an enormous weakness under its own floor. Because a dragon in her shed cannot fly. She cannot burn. The old plate is dead and the new plate is not in, and for 100 years the strongest thing in the country can be opened by a man with a good knife and some nerve. So you hide her. You do not use her name. You do not let anyone count the years. And you certainly never let it be known which of your women is down there and how far along she is. Because the moment somebody knows, they know exactly how long you are soft for, and they will simply wait for the middle of it. Wars in this kingdom are not fought when somebody is angry. They are fought when somebody is shedding. Belle told me that at the vats with her sleeves rolled up, and she thought she was telling me something everyone knew. Now put my 4 hours in that cell against all of that. Ivy and Vale came to the yard 3 days after the plate sold. I had never seen a dragon woman out of a cellar and I did not know what I was looking at until Belle put her hand flat on my chest and pushed me back a step behind the drying racks. She came on foot with 2 people. She wore gray. She was tall in the way that makes a doorway look badly built, and the scale on her forearms was so dark it was almost black, and it was perfect. Not a chip in it. Not a dull spot anywhere. That is what a dragon looks like when the shed went the ordinary way and finished a long time ago. 90 years younger than her sister and done with it, and every man in the yard took his cap off without being told to. She looked at the vats for a while. She asked Hask something I could not hear. Hask laughed too hard at it. Then, loud enough for the yard, the Vale house would be buying its own grit back from now on, at the yard price, all of it, every sack, and would prefer that none of it be sold on. Every man there did the arithmetic on his own wages and stopped smiling. She was not finished. The cellar under the house would be closed for a year for the good of the elder daughter's rest. The spring pickers were dismissed with thanks. No further hands were needed for the good of her rest. I stood there and heard a woman with hook scars and rows down her back described as resting. And then Ivy and Vale turned her head and looked directly at me, past 30 men, from 100 feet away, and I found out what it is to be looked at by something that could put me through a wall without changing its expression. She did not come over. She sent one of hers. A soft man with wet eyes called Almut, who smelled of orange peel and who spoke to me very kindly. The lady is grateful. The lady understands you had a lucky day. Here is what the lady thinks would be best. The purse had 6 gold in it. 6, when the plate had gone for 420. Sit with that for a moment the way I had to. The offer attached to it was a place at the Vale stables out past the Watergate, feeding horses, with a bed and a coat and 2 meals, and it was a good offer. It was a genuinely good offer for a man worth 9 copper. All I had to do was take it and never go down those stairs again. I looked over Almut's shoulder at the woman in gray, and she was already talking to somebody else, because it had not occurred to her that I might refuse. That is what stayed with me. I said no. Almut's face did a small, sad, professional thing. He put the purse away. He said he would tell the lady I was thinking about it, and that I should do my thinking in a house with a door on it, because Chainside gets cold at night. Then everybody left, and Hask took me behind the pressing shed and hit me twice, once in the stomach and once on the ear, and explained that I had just cost the yard the Vale contract, and that I was a rat with clever hands, and that he should have left me in the gutter he found me in. That evening I sat on the step outside the pressing shed with my ear ringing and I could not think of one single thing to do next. No name here. No family, no trade, no standing, no coin except 2 copper, no right to be anywhere I was standing. In my old life I was nothing much, but at least I was nothing much with a bank card and a door key. Belle came and sat down 2 steps away with a heel of bread, and tore it, and gave me the bigger half without saying anything about it. Her mother was called Marta and did other people's washing at the trough behind the dog and ladder. Belle's whole plan for her own life at that time was to get her mother out of that trough before her hands went the way of Ott's arm. She asked me what I had actually done down there. Not what it sold for. What I did. So I told her. Heat, oil, time, angle, and never pull. It took about a minute and a half to explain, and when I had finished she sat there with her mouth open, and then she said the smartest thing anybody said to me that year. If it is that easy, then it is not a secret, it is a habit. And habits belong to whoever does them first out loud. I did not sleep. Around the 4th hour I got up and walked to Kettle Bridge, which is the armorer's end of the city, and I sat down against a wall opposite a shop with a hammer painted on the shutter, and I waited for it to open. The man who owned it was called Wexel. He was 60, deaf in one ear, and he had my plate laid out on 2 trestles in the back room with a sheet over it like a patient. He had already cut a corner off it. He showed me the corner. He had spent 3 days trying to work that corner and had ruined 2 chisels and a good file, and he was the happiest man in Brackhold. You cannot forge it. You cannot draw it, you cannot cut it, and you cannot get it hot enough to care. So you shape the man to the plate instead of the plate to the man. He said all that to the room, and I was the only one in the room. Then he looked at me properly for the first time. You are the boy from the yard. I am the boy who took it off. Hask took it off. Hask has hands like 2 gloves full of soup. Ask him what temperature the water was. Wexel went very quiet. Then he wanted the temperature of the water, and he got it, and he got how long, and he got why the edge lifts from the top of the shoulder downward and never the other way, and somewhere in the middle of it he sat down on a barrel. He had a commission from a man in the capital, and he had 1 plate, and he wanted 3. Nobody in the history of his trade had ever wanted 3, because nobody had ever had one. I wanted one thing. Back down those stairs. And I have thought since about how cheaply I sold myself that morning, and I have decided I do not care. It cost him a bag of coin for Hask, a mule cart, a note against the Vale Grit contract, and 1 sentence. The sentence mattered more than the coin did. Wexel of Kettle Bridge would buy every whole plate out of that cellar at 300 gold, and would buy no grit from the yard at all, from anybody, ever again, if a boy called Kess was not the man doing the taking. Hask read it 4 times. I stood there and watched him read it 4 times, and watched him understand that the entire value of the yard he had run for 20 years had just moved into the hands of a man he had paid 2 copper. He was not angry. That is what unsettled me. He got very friendly. He put his arm around me and called me his boy, and promised we would sort out shares later, like reasonable people. Then he sent a runner up to the Vale house to explain, carefully, that the cellar could not stay closed, because Ivy and Vale could stop the yard selling grit but she could not stop the yard buying, and the money was now flowing the other way. It took 2 days. I do not know what went on in that house, and I would give a great deal to know. On the 3rd morning the bar came off the door and I went down the stairs with a copper pot, a jug of clean oil, 4 horsehair brushes I had picked myself off a broommaker on Snell Street, and a stool. Asha was where I had left her. She did not lift her head when the door opened. She had heard the bar and had assumed pickers. Then she smelled the oil. Kess? Yes. She was quiet for a moment, and when she spoke her voice had gone careful in a way that was hard to listen to, because careful means a person is protecting herself from hope. They told me you took the money and went to the stables. Who told you that? My sister. Through the door. She was very sorry about it. Well, that is going to be an awkward supper for somebody. I am going to be straight about the work now, because the work is the story. A grown dragon in her shed carries somewhere between 600 and 900 plates, depending on how you count the small ones down the flank and along the tail. Asha and I counted hers over about a week and stopped at 740 because we were both getting depressed. 1 plate, done properly, took between 2 and 5 hours. The shoulder plates were slow. The long ones over the ribs came faster, because once the edge is up on a long plate, the edge runs. So the arithmetic of a whole shed, with 1 man working, is a little over 3 years. 3 years against 100. That is the business. That is the number the whole business is built on, and I did not understand for months how many people would kill to keep it from being spoken out loud. We did not have 3 years and we did not have a plan. What we had was a bargain, and we made it on the 2nd morning, and it was this: my hands for her mouth. I would work. She would talk. Everything she knew about this city and this kingdom, who owned what and who owed whom and which of it was still true, poured into a man who had been alive here for 4 days. She had 80 years of listening through a floor and nothing else to do with any of it. And she started with the thing that put the hair up on my arms, and it came out flat, while I was working oil into the seam of the 3rd plate on her left side. Cass. When the house is quiet, and the wind is off the river, and the water gate is shut so the wheel stops turning. Yes. I can hear another one. I made her repeat it 3 times and each time it was the same. When the wheel at the water gate stops turning, and the house goes quiet, something breathes in the drains. Not words. A sound like somebody dragging a chair very slowly across a floor a long way off, and then a pause, and then it again. How long? 40 years, near enough. I thought it was me at first. You hear yourself and stone down here. I lay on the floor of that cell with my ear over the middle drain for most of an afternoon while she waited and did not once remark on how stupid I looked. 6 drains. That is what I had counted on my first day, standing with my back to the door and being afraid. 6 drains, cut in a fan, all running toward the low corner and out under the west wall. West is the river. The Vale House sits above the old lower town, and everything under Brackhole drains toward the Nail, and the drains were dug before any of these families had a name, which means the cellars are joined. Not by doors. By water. I asked whether any house on that line would be shedding, and she started naming them, and about 6 names and she stopped and went very still. The Kessel house has no women left in it. Not one. They have not had a daughter in 200 years and old Kessel died before my shed began. So who is in their cellar? She did not go near that. What came instead was that she had put the sound to her sister once, through the door, 11 years ago, and her sister had explained about rats in the pipes, and then she had the drain in the low corner covered with an iron grate, and stone laid over the grate. An iron grate. Over a drain. In a room where the only thing that matters is that filth runs out. Somebody in that house did not want a sound getting through, and that is the single most useful thing anybody told me that spring. We kept working. That is the true shape of all of it. Underneath the politics and the money and the enormous women who could end me, my days were a man on a stool with a pot of hot water. Plate 4 came off on a Tuesday and it was the size of a tabletop and Wexel wept when he saw it. He is not a soft man. He put his hand flat on it and his chin went and he turned round so we would not watch. Plate 5 stuck at the top corner and cost me 9 hours and I ruined it, and it came away in 3 pieces, and I sat on the floor afterward with my hands shaking and could not talk to anybody. Asha waited that whole time and did not once push me to hurry. Then she said, in the dark, that in 80 years nobody had ever ruined anything on her and been sorry about it, and that it was a strange thing to sit and watch. Plate 6 taught me the trick with the wet cloth held against the seam by her own hand, because her hands were hot in a way that mine were not, and after that everything went faster. She was the tool I had been missing. She could hold heat where I needed it for as long as I needed it, and once we worked that out we were doing a plate in under 2 hours. It came back in an order, and I kept the order because it turned out to matter. Her sleep came back first. 3 nights and she slept for 14 hours and woke up and was frightened, because she had not slept more than 2 hours at a stretch since the rain before this one.
Her voice came back second. The crack in it was from screaming, and once the screaming stopped, the crack went, and one afternoon she remarked on the weather, and we both stopped, because it had come out in a voice like a bell in a good tower.
Her hands stopped shaking third. And on the 9th day she stood up. She got a hand on the wall and put her weight on her legs and rose all the way up to her full height, and her head went into the dark above the lamps where I could not see it. I sat on my stool with a brush in my hand and understood, physically, for the first time, what I had been sitting next to. 9 feet of her. Shoulders like a doorframe. And that was her in the shape she wears in a house. I asked what she was in the other shape, and she put me off, kindly, until another time. Then she took 2 steps, which was as far as her legs would go, and sat down hard, and laughed until she cried, and I put my head down and pretended to be busy with the oil. Little things. She asked me for a comb, and I brought her a wooden one off a stall on Snell Street kept by a woman called Risico, and she used it and then held it out at arm's length and studied it, because she had not held an object that was not food in about 60 years. She asked whether the bakery at the top of Marrow Row still burned the bottoms. It did. She was very pleased about that. She asked about her horse, Little Bishop, and I had to explain that a horse does not live 80 years, and she said of course, 3 times, and then asked me to talk about something else for a while. There was one afternoon around the 2nd week when I had to work the plates under her arm, and there is no dignified way to do that, and the room got extremely quiet. She held her arm up. I worked. Neither of us spoke a single word for 2 hours, and when it was done she said, in a completely flat voice, that she would appreciate it if I never mentioned any part of that to anybody living. Agreed. Ever. Agreed. And then she started laughing and could not stop, and knocked the pot over with her tail, and I spent the rest of the afternoon mopping while she apologized in a way that got less sincere every time she said it. That was the day I stopped being frightened of her, and it is also the day I noticed I had stopped, which are 2 different days for most people and were the same day for me. Word got up the stairs before I did. It always does. By the 3rd week the Vale House had 2 men on the cellar stairs instead of 1, and a cook who found reasons to come down and look, and a girl called Nun who carried the water for me and told everybody upstairs exactly what she saw.
That is how IVN found out that her sister was standing up. Understand what that meant to her, because I did not understand it for far too long, and I was cruel about her in my own head before I did the arithmetic properly. Evian Vale was 42 years old when the shed took her sister. She had never run anything. She had been the second daughter, which in that house meant she was the one who was good at parties. And then the elder went into the cellar, and somebody had to hold a house with 9 tenant farms, a river toll, a stake in the Kettlebridge trade, and about 400 people who ate because of it. She held it for 80 years. She held it through 2 bad winters and 1 very bad king. She married a man to fix a debt. She learned to be the thing that walks into a room and makes the room quiet. And now, in the cellar, a bath boy was steadily bringing back the only person alive who had a better claim to all of it.
She never once put that to me. She was far too good for that. What she did was invite me to supper. I want to describe that supper properly. It was in the small hall of the Vale House, which is small the way a church is small. 14 chairs. 3 lamps. A fire that could have taken a cow. I had one coat and it was Belle's father's old one, and Belle's father had been a shorter man with wider shoulders, and I looked like a boy in a costume, and I knew it walking in. There were 4 people at that table. IVN. Almut with his orange peel. A neighbor of theirs from the Farrow house, an old woman called Dame Farrow who was deaf and enormously entertained by everything, and a man of about 50 with grey in his beard and good hands who was introduced to me as Reverend Marr, of the Marr house, husband to the lady. He shook my hand. He looked me in the face, which none of the others quite did. He asked me one question, which was whether the work hurt her, and when I promised it did not, he sat back and did not say anything else for the length of 2 courses. Ivian was charming. That is not sarcasm. She was genuinely, expensively charming, and she asked about the bathhouse in my old life as though it were a country she had always meant to visit, and she laughed in the right places. And then over the fish, what is the plan? The plan? For my sister. When it is done. 3 years, by your own count. What is she then? She is a woman with her own legs under her. That is what I said. Yes. And whose is the house? Dame Farrow, who is deaf, chose that moment to announce loudly that the fish was excellent, and everyone was very grateful to her. What I said was that I take dead plate off people and I do not have opinions about houses. What I should have given her is that I already knew, and so did she, and that a man with no opinion in a room like that has just let everybody know he can be moved later. She smiled at me. How sensible. And then came the thing she had brought me there for, kindly, over fish, in front of witnesses who did not understand a word of it. There are people in this city who would pay you a great deal more to leave a woman half done than to finish her. I hope, when they come to you, that you will remember you had supper here. Then Almut poured the wine and everybody talked about the river. Reverend Marr caught me in the passage on the way out. No servants in it. He is not a subtle man and he did not try to be.
Is she still herself? She is exactly herself. He put his hand flat on the wall for a second, the way you do when a stair is not where you thought it was. Then he told me, quietly and quickly, like a man who has decided something on the spot and wants it done before he can take it back, that 81 years ago he had been going to marry Ashaya Vale in the spring, and that the shed came in the autumn, and that he had waited 7 years, which is a long time for a man, and no time at all for a house, and then the Vale debt needed a Marr name on it, and there was a younger sister, and everybody behaved extremely well about the whole thing. I asked him whether Ivian knew he still thought about it. My wife knows everything about me, and that is not the same as us talking about it, and then he went back inside. I walked home to Chainside past the Dog and Ladder, where a potboy called Nib was throwing out a carter who had been singing the one about the sailor and the shoe badly since noon. I went past Marta at her trough even at that hour, and I sat down on the step of the drying shed and thought about it. So I counted up what I had. A woman who wanted her sister finished slowly, or ideally not at all, and who had just very politely warned me that somebody was going to offer me money to stop. A man in that same house who wanted her finished yesterday and could not speak it out loud. An armorer who wanted plates and did not care about anything else in the world. A yard master who was taking half of everything I earned and calling me his boy while he did it. And something breathing in a drain under a house with no women in it. I was 26 years old in this body, and 10 weeks into a world I did not understand, and I did the only thing that was actually mine to do.
I went and found Belle, and offered to teach her. She refused, immediately, which surprised me. Then it came out that she had thought about it since the night on the step, and that if she learned it, and Hask found out she had learned it, he would sell her to a house the way he had sold me, and she would never see her mother again. So teach me somewhere he cannot see. And nobody hears that I can do it until I can do it better than you. That is the deal we made, and we made it standing up behind the pressing shed, and it was the most valuable thing I did that year, and it took 4 minutes. We started the next morning on a dead pig. You can practice on a pig. A pig is close enough. The principal sits on anything with a hide, and I got 2 from a butcher called Sefer who thought we were mad and gave us a discount for the entertainment. Belle was better than me inside a month. That embarrassed me at the time, and I have made peace with it since. She has small hands and enormous patience and no ego about the work at all, and where I would push at a bad edge to see if it would come, she would just put the cloth back on and sit there and wait. And on the day she took a clean sheet of hide off a pig in one piece and held it up and looked at me over the top of it, we both understood the thing that changed all of it from something about me into something about everybody. It is not a gift. It is a method. A method can be taught. A method can be written down. A method has no interest at all in who your grandmother was.
Which is exactly why, about 10 days later, a woman I had never met walked into the yard at dusk and put a hook through my coat and most of the way into my shoulder. Her name was Hessa Rel, and she was Ott's daughter, and she had a picking hook in her fist, and she used it on me the way you use a boat hook, low and up and in. It went through the coat and into the meat over my shoulder blade, and she twisted it, because that is what the tool is for. You do not know what you are doing, she told the back of my neck. You have never seen one go wrong. I have seen 4. Then Piner hit her with a bucket, which is the least heroic thing that has ever saved my life, and it worked perfectly, and she went down on the cobbles and the hook came out of me, and I found out what my own blood smells like in cold air. I want to be fair to Hessa Rel because I was not fair to her at the time, and it cost me a year. The Rels had been pickers for 9 generations. Her great-grandmother picked for the crown. In her family it was not a cruelty, it was a craft, and there were rules to it that they kept, and other people did not. You pick in spring when the humor is high. You never take more than 3 plates from one woman in a season. You do not touch the ridge, you do not touch the throat, and you stop the moment she begins to bleed dark. And the reason for all of that is the thing I had not thought about once, not one single time, in 3 months of feeling clever. A dragon coming out of her shed too fast can die, not from the work, from the new plate coming in wrong. Scale sets by the row, top to bottom, and each row leans on the one above it, and if you take a middle row before the row above has hardened, the new plate comes in unseated and it never sets at all. Then the skin under it stays open, then it goes bad. And then a creature that was going to live another 6,000 years dies in a cellar in about 12 days, in a way that Hessa Rel had watched happen to a woman called Marison Kessel when she was 9 years old. I did not know any of that when she put the hook in me. She knew it and had no words to make anybody listen, so she used the tool she had.
Ott came down from the vats and stood over her and did not help her up, and the 2 of them looked at each other with 60 years of something between them. Then he turned to me, one-handed, apron on, and he said the only advice he ever gave me directly: she is wrong about you and she is right about the scale. Learn the second thing and forget the first. I could not lift my right arm for 9 days. That was the accident that made everything else possible, and I have noticed since that most good things in my life arrived disguised as a disaster with a bucket in it. Because for 9 days I could not work, and the plates had to keep coming, and Wexel's money was already spent, and Hask was watching me the way a man watches a horse with a limp. So Belle went down the stairs instead of me. I told Asha the night before. I told her there was a girl, 17, from the vats, who had learned it on pigs and who was better than me on an edge and who had never touched a living thing. And Asha, who had 81 years of iron hooks in her back and every reason in the world to refuse, thought about it for a while in the dark and then wanted to know one thing only: does she want to do it? She does. Then send her down. Belle did 2 plates in her first day. She did them slower than me and cleaner than me, and she did not chip an edge. When she came up she sat on the step and shook for about 20 minutes and would not let anybody touch her. Then she went down the next morning and did 2 more. And that is the moment, if you want a moment, when this stopped being a story about a lucky bath boy. One man with a trick is a curiosity. Two people with a method is a trade, and a trade has apprentices, and apprentices have apprentices, and there is no bottom to that. Asha understood it before I did. She had been talking to Belle all day while I lay upstairs on a pallet feeling sorry for myself, and when I finally got down the stairs on the 10th day, she had a question ready. How many girls are there in that yard? 9, maybe 12 with the ones who only come in winter. And how many cellars in this city? I did not have that number. Nobody had that number. That was the whole point of the way this kingdom was arranged.
So we started counting, and the counting is what brought the first stranger to Chainside. He came on a Sunday in a good hat. He was called Perrin Aske, and he was a factor, which in Brackhold means a man who buys things on behalf of somebody who does not want to be seen buying them. He was polite. He bought me a hot pie from the stall by the ferry, which I ate because I was hungry and because a pie is not a bribe if you are honest about it afterwards. Then he made his offer, and it was exactly the offer Ivien Vale had warned me about over fish, which is how I knew she had not been threatening me. She had been telling me the weather. 300 gold a year. Not to work faster, not to work at all in a particular house.
I asked which house. Any house, he said, that my principal names, in the year that my principal names it. Some years there will be no name at all and you will simply be paid. And then, seeing my face, he explained it to me the way you explain a thing to a slow child, kindly, because he genuinely thought he was offering me an easy life. Nobody wants your woman hurt. Nobody is going to touch her. It is enough for my principal that she is still in the cellar in the spring. That is all. Simply be busy elsewhere. I have thought about that offer more than any other moment of that year, and what went through me was not disgust. It was relief. For about 4 seconds it was relief, because 300 gold a year is a house on the hill and Marta out of her trough and Belle in shoes that fit, and all I would have to do is be busy. That is how it gets you. Nobody ever offers you a knife. They offer you a reason to be somewhere else. I turned it down, and Perrin Aske was not upset, and that frightened me more than anything he had said. He shook my hand. He hoped I would keep well. He mentioned the Chainside floods in a wet spring. Then he went back up the hill and I stood there holding half a pie. Belle wanted to know what he had wanted and I told her, and she sat down on the barrow and did the arithmetic out loud, 300 a year against what we were making, and it was not close. Then she said, that is not a man who buys nothing. If he is paying to keep someone in a cellar, then somebody in a cellar is worth money to him standing still. Which is the same sentence as the one Asha had already given me, from the other side. If you know who is soft, you know when to move. That night we went into the drains. There is a grate behind the Chainside vats where the yard water goes out into the nail below the gull steps, and it is a foot under the surface most of the year, and in the dry end of summer it is not. Belle had been in there as a child on a dare. She knew the first 3 turns. After that it was a lamp, a chalk mark at every branch, and the two of us bent over double in a pipe built by people who had never met us. I will not pretend it was an adventure. It was cold and it stank and we were both terrified, and about the 6th turn I put my hand in something soft and did not investigate. The pipes ran the way pipes run, which is downhill toward the river, and Asha had given me the count of the turns from the sound, and at the 9th turn we came up under a stone shaft with iron rungs and a grate at the top, and the grate had been recently oiled.
Recently oiled. In a house that had had no living owner for 200 years. We came up in a cellar the size of the Vale cellar and laid out the same way, and there were 6 drains in the floor, and the drains were dry, and at the far end, against the wall, there was a woman. She did not move when the lamp found her. For a bad moment I thought I was looking at a body that had been left. Then she lifted her head, and her eyes came around, and they were the same lamp green as Asha's, and she looked at us with an expression I have never been able to get out of my head.
She was not surprised. She had heard us coming down the pipe for 10 minutes and she had lain there working out whether we were worth speaking to. Her plate was black. All over. Not dark green, black, the way a leaf goes black in a gutter, and it was lifted in 100 places and welded down in 1,000. And the smell in that room was the smell in the cell on my first day multiplied by a number I did not want. Belle put her hand over her mouth and did not make a sound, and I have always been proud of her for that. How long? The woman had to try 3 times before her voice worked at all. What year is it? I gave her the year. She lay there and did the arithmetic, and I watched her do it, and then she put her head back down on the stone and something went out of her. 241, she said. I came down in the year of the flood, and it was the 11th year of my shed then. 241 years in a cellar. A shed runs 100. Hers had finished 140 years ago and nobody had come to open the door. She had been lying under a dead plate that was not even hers anymore, because the new one under it had come in and hardened and grown its own dead layer on top, and the two had fused into one shell, and she had gone from shedding to buried. Belle was crying without any sound at all and doing her work anyway, walking the room with the lamp, and it was Belle who found the tray by the wall. A wooden tray, the kind you carry bread on. Clean. Nothing on it but crumbs and a cup. Somebody had been feeding her. Every day, for 241 years, somebody had come down into that cellar with a tray and left it and gone back up and said nothing to anybody. Who brings the food? The woman on the floor made a sound that had once been a laugh. Boys, she said. They send boys. They are always frightened of me and they are always new. Nobody sends the same boy twice. Then she looked past me at the shaft we had come down, and her voice changed, and she pushed herself up onto one elbow with an effort that took a full minute. You came up the pipe. That means you came from the Vale cellar. Is the Vale girl still alive down there?
She is. Then listen to me and do not be clever about it. Do not touch me tonight. Go back and finish her and get her out and get her up into the air where people can see her. Why? Because I am the reason your city believes a shed is 100 years and a cellar is a mercy, and the woman who put me down here is going to hear about you inside a month. Belle asked the question I did not want to ask. Who put you down here? And the woman on the floor of the Kessel cellar said a name I had never heard in my life, and I carried it back up the pipe like a stone in my mouth, and when I got back to the Vale cellar at the 4th hour of the morning I gave it to Asha. Kala. Asha had been sitting up waiting. When I said it, she did not gasp and she did not swear. She got very slowly to her feet, all 9 feet of her, and stood there in the dark for a long moment, and when she spoke, her voice was completely level, and it was the first time since I met her that I was frightened of her again. Kes, sit down. There is a thing about my people that I have not explained to you, and you are going to need it now. Every dragon alive has shed. Every one. It is what we are. It is how we grow, and there is not one of us in the world who has not spent 100 years on a cellar floor being ashamed of it. Except one. Kala is 2,300 years old and she has never shed. Not once. Not ever. She is wearing the plate she grew into as a young thing when this city was a fishing camp, and she has worn it through 4 dynasties and 31 kings and the whole of everything anyone alive remembers. A shed comes at 1,000 years. Hers was due when the walls of Brackhold were being laid out with string. She refused it. She kept refusing it. She is 1,300 years past due, and she is the strongest creature on this side of the water. Asha explained it while I sat on the stool and did not work, which almost never happened. It is not a trick and it is not magic. You can refuse it. The plate stays on and the new one grows in under it and packs down and gets no room, and you get harder and heavier and slower every century, and it hurts every day forever, and you never lie in a cellar. That is what she bought. Why does everyone care what she did with her own body? Because she is the only one of us who has never been weak in front of anybody, said Asha. In 2,300 years, nobody has ever seen her down. That shell of hers is a throne. She made it a shame, not with a law because she has never needed one. She just lived long enough and stayed hard long enough that every mother in every house started hiding her daughter out of habit. And the cellars followed, and the pickers followed, and the yards on Chainside followed, and the whole gray trade of boiling somebody's grandmother into cheap jerkins for carters, and none of it was ever ordered by anyone. Have you ever met her? Twice, Asha said. Once when I was 160 and she came to my mother's table, and once 82 years ago, 3 weeks before I went down. What happened 82 years ago? She came and looked at me. She held my chin. She told my mother that I would go down in the autumn, and that the family would be sensible about it. And then, Asha said, she went home, and it happened exactly the way she had described it, because when she describes a thing it happens, and it happens because nobody alive can bear to be the one who disobeys her. Now, Ula, I went back down that pipe 16 times that spring, and I did nothing down there but sit with her. Ula of the Kessel house was 3,000 years old when she went into her shed. Her family were nothing much. river people with 2 boats and a name. And in the 11th year of her shed, she did something that nobody had ever done before, which was that she came up the stairs in daylight, in front of her own household, with her plate lifting and her voice gone, and she stood in her own courtyard and let them look.
She wanted help. She had worked out on her own, lying on that floor, that 100 years of hiding was doing the harm, and she came up to ask for hands. 9 days later Kala came to the Kessel house. There was no fight, Ol told me, on the 4th night I sat with her. There was never going to be a fight. I could not stand. She came in and she was very kind. She had my family in the room. She explained to them that I was ill, and that illness in a house is a private thing, and that she would come herself every year to see how I was resting. And she did. Every year, for 140 years, until the last Kessel died and the house went to a cousin and then to a merchant and then to nobody. And then, Ol said, she kept coming. She is the only one left who remembers me. She comes down that shaft in the spring and she stands where you are standing and she asks whether I have changed my mind about anything. What is the question, then? Whether shedding is a private thing. That is all it has ever been. That is what the woman under the Kessel house has been asked once a year for 241 years, and the reason she is still down there is that she keeps giving the wrong answer. I did not touch her plate. Not that spring. Hesarel was right and I had learned it the hard way by then, and Ul's shell was 2 sheds thick and welded to itself and there was no honest way to open it in a hurry. What I did instead was bring a lamp, and a chair, and news. She wanted news the way other people want water. Who is king now? What does the bridge look like? Is the ferry still where it was? Whether the bakery at the top of Marrow Row still burns the bottoms, which is apparently a thing that dragons have been complaining about for 400 years. And on the 11th visit, she asked me to describe the sky, and I did it badly, and she made me do it again. Meanwhile the trade got away from me, which was the plan and was still a shock. It started with the sand house, which is not a great house. 3 streets, a mill, and an aunt in the cellar who had been down 6 years and whose family could not pay Wexel's kind of money and did not pretend they could. Van Sant came to Chainside himself with his hat in his hands and offered me the mill for 1 year of work, and I looked at this man, who was about 50, who had clearly not slept, and I gave him the terms that ended up being the terms for everything after.
No money, you give me a girl. He did not understand. Somebody from your house, somebody young with hands and patience who comes to the yard and learns the whole method from Belle and then goes home and does your aunt herself. And when she is done, she owes me one thing and one thing only, which is that she teaches the next house that asks. He stood there in the yard with the vat steaming behind him and he did the arithmetic and he could not find where I was cheating him, and that made him more suspicious than any price would have. Why? Because I am one man with a bad shoulder and there are 400 sellers in this kingdom, and I have 3 years in me and no more. He gave me his sister's daughter. Her name was Helpless. She was 19. She was afraid of me for about 4 days, and 8 months later she was better than Belle. That was the first. By the end of that autumn, there were 9 of them in the yard, learning on pigs and on each other. And Marda had left the trough behind the dog and ladder to run the wash for the shed rooms, which was better paid and warmer and made her insufferable in a way that delighted her daughter. And the yard changed. Hask still owned Chainside and Hask still took his half, and I still had to look at him every morning, but the vats went cold one at a time. Belle had stopped hiding it by then. Every house that wanted a girl trained sent her to Belle, and Hask had to stand in his own gateway and watch them come in with their hats in their hands. He cannot sell me now, she said, with her sleeves still wet. Who would he sell me to? Every house on this river would rather pay me by the day, and he would have to stand there and say out loud that he let me go. Nobody was selling grit anymore because nobody was picking, and a whole plate does not go in a vat, it goes to Kettlebridge on a cart with a blanket over it. Ott stood by the cold vats for a week with his one hand and did not know what to do with himself. Then he started making brushes. He made them better than the broom maker on Snell Street. He made a curved one for the hollow behind the knee that nobody had thought of, and by winter every shed room in the city had 4 Ott brushes, and he charged too little for them, and Belle shouted at him about it constantly. And in the middle of all that, in the second winter, the Pharaoh house nearly killed a woman and Hessa Rel saved her, and that is how I got the Rels. Dame Pharaoh, the deaf one from the supper, had a niece in her cellar, 40 years down. The Pharaohs were rich, impatient, and they had a girl of their own trained at the yard, whose name was Pell Pharaoh, and who was good. But the house wanted it done by midsummer, because there was a marriage in it, and they pushed her, and she took the rows out of order. She went down the flank, taking every other plate because it was faster and because the flank plates are easy, and she left rows of new scale standing up unsupported like a fence, with every second post pulled out. By the 4th day, the girl in that cellar was bleeding dark, and by the 6th she had a fever, and by the 7th the Pharaoh house sent a boy to Chainside on a horse called Trout in the middle of the night.
I got there and I could not fix it. I want that on the record. I stood in the Pharaoh cellar with my hands over a woman who was dying, and I did not know what to do, because everything I knew was about taking a plate off and nothing I knew was about putting a world back under it. Belle was the one who ran for Hesse. Not me. I would not have thought of it. Hesse Rel came in from Marrow Row in her nightclothes with a satchel of hooks and one long iron spatula her grandmother had made. She looked at that flank for about 4 seconds and told the room exactly what had been done wrong, in language I will not repeat, some of which was aimed at me and was fair. Then she worked for 19 hours. She did not take anything off. She put the fallen rows back. She seated each unsupported plate against its neighbor and held it with a wedge of soft pine, 41 wedges, cut on the spot by a carpenter she sent for herself, and she packed the whole flank in wet linen and made us keep it wet. And the woman lived. Her name was Nessa Pharaoh, and by all rights she should have been dead in a cellar because I taught a girl a method and did not teach her a limit. When it was over, Hesse sat on the cellar steps with her hands ruined and she would not look at me, and I sat down 2 steps away, which is a thing I learned from Belle. Will you teach at the yard? No. Will you teach the limits, then? Not the taking. The order of rows, the season, the throat, the dark blood, the 3 plates. She was quiet for a while. Then she wanted to know what I would call them. The Rel rules. She laughed at me. She actually laughed, with her hands in a bowl of cold water and her hair stuck to her face, and she told me I was a shameless little man and that my father must have been a market trader. Then she said yes. And that is how the only written thing in this whole trade came to exist, and it is 9 lines long, and it hangs in every shed room in this kingdom, and it has her family name on it and not mine. Which brings me to the 14th of Thaw, in the 2nd spring, and Asha coming up the stairs. We had done 690 plates. There were 50 odd left, all of them small, all of them down the tail, and none of them mattered for what she could do.
I had known for about a month that she could go up whenever she wanted. So had she. Neither of us had brought it up, and I am not going to pretend I do not know why. Down there I was the person who came. Up there I was going to be a man from the yard with a bad shoulder who had done a job. It was Belle who finally lost patience with the pair of us. She came down with a bucket she did not need, and she stood in the middle of that cellar and asked Asha straight out whether she was going to sit in a hole for the rest of her life out of politeness. Asha looked at me. Then she stood up, and she put her hand on the wall, and she walked to the bottom of the stairs and stopped, because the stairs were built for people, and she is not people. She had to go up them bent over with both hands on the steps in front of her, like a child, and she was ashamed of it, and I went up behind her and did not offer to help because she had not asked. 19 steps. It took her a long time. The door at the top of those stairs opens into the back of a scullery, and the scullery has a window, and the window faces east, and it was about the 6th hour of the morning. She stopped in the doorway with the light on her face, and she made a sound I am not going to try to write down, and everybody in that kitchen, 3 cooks and the girl Nen and a boy with an armful of kindling, turned around and dropped what they were holding. Then she walked out into the yard of her own house. 81 years after they carried her down, and she stood in the middle of it and put her head back. And every single person in the Vale house came out to look at her. Nobody called them. The sound went through that building like water through a cracked cup, and they came. And they were not looking at their lady. Most of them were born after she went down. They were looking at a 9-foot woman with pale new plate the color of a green apple, standing in the sun with her eyes shut, crying in the way that has no noise in it. Evian Vale came out last in gray and stopped on the top step and did not come down. Her face did something I did not have a name for at the time and have thought about for years since. It was not hate and it was not guilt. It was a woman looking at the end of the only job she had ever been given. Nobody warns you about this. She came up the stairs, and then she had to live somewhere. For 9 days, the Vale house was a party. Cousins arrived from the coast. A cousin nobody liked arrived from further than the coast. Somebody killed a pig, and somebody else killed 2 more. And on the 10th day, everybody went back to work, and Asha stood in the middle of the upper hall of her own house and had nothing whatsoever to do. The steward answered to Evian. The tenants knew Evian. The river toll was collected by a man who had been hired by Evian and who called Asha my lady in a voice with a question mark in it. Her own bedroom had been a linen store for 60 years and smelled of it. And she was enormous. That is a stupid thing to have to write down, but it is true, and it mattered every hour of every day. Doorways, chairs, stairs. A woman who cannot sit down at her own table without breaking it is a guest in her own house. She was very good about all of it, and that was worse. The talk with her sister happened on the 14th night, and I was not in the room, and I have the whole of it anyway. Asha gave it to me afterward on the wall by the Watergate, at 3 in the morning, in about 400 words that she had clearly been rehearsing all evening. Evian did not apologize. That is the first thing. She sat down across from her sister and gave her an account. Not of money, though there was money in it. Of years. She went through them, all 80, the way you go through a ledger you have been keeping in your head because you never dared write it down. The 2 winters when the mill flooded and the tenants ate house grain. The 11th year when the Mar debt would have taken the West Farms and she married Revan to stop it. The bad king and what it cost to be forgotten by him on purpose. And then, in the middle of it, without changing her voice, she gave Asha the part she did not have to give. For 11 of those years, she said, I kept you down there on purpose, and it had nothing to do with your health. Asha waited. The war years, Evian said. If it had been known that the elder Vale was soft in her cellar, we would have been taken apart in a season. The pharaohs knew. The pharaohs were the only ones who knew, and I paid the pharaohs for 11 years to go on not knowing. So you kept me weak. I kept you secret. Keeping you weak was how it was done, and I am not going to pretend those are different things at this hour of the night. And after the war? That one, Evian said, I cannot dress up. After the war there were 4 years when there was no reason at all. I simply did not send for anyone. I did not decide anything. I let it go on, the way you let a letter go unanswered until answering it becomes the hard thing. Then she put her hands flat on the table and made the offer. The house is yours. It has always been yours. Say the word tonight, and I will hand you every key in this building in the morning, and go to the coast, and you will not have to look at me again. And Asha, who had 81 years of iron hooks in her back, and who had lain in the dark listening to that woman's footsteps cross the floor above her for 3 decades, looked at her sister and asked one question. Do you want to go? No. Then keep the keys. That was not forgiveness. Asha is not soft, and she does not hand things over out of kindness. She had spent 81 years learning exactly what she was and was not able to do, and she had worked out, somewhere between the stairs and that table, that she did not want a river toll. She wanted the thing she had been lying on a floor thinking about for a lifetime. She wanted the cellar. Give me the cellar, she said. The room, the stairs, the yard door, and the right to put whoever I like in it. Evian did not understand. Nobody understood for about a month, because what Asha did with that cellar is the reason her name is the one people know now, and I had nothing to do with it. She had the chains cut out of the wall. She had the iron grate lifted off the drain and the stone taken up. She had lamps put in, 40 of them, and a stove, and a floor of scrubbed pine over the stone, and a door with no bar on the outside of it. And then she opened it. Not to her house, to the city. Any woman of any family, great or nothing, in her shed, could come to the Vale cellar and be worked on by trained hands, and the price was what the family could pay, and if the family could pay nothing, then the price was nothing. That was the first shed room in the world. It was in the same room, on the same floor, under the same house, and she did it on purpose, so that everybody would have to walk down those exact 19 stairs to get to it. The first woman through the door was Nessa Farrow, the one Hessa had saved with pine wedges, carried in on a litter by her own aunt. The second was a woman from the fishing quarter whose family name I will leave out because her grandchildren are alive, and who had been in a coal cellar with a curtain across it for 30 years, and whose people had genuinely believed that was normal. By midsummer there were 4 shed rooms in Brackhold, and 1 in Hesk over a bakery belonging to a man called Gell, and 1 on the North Road at Cold Harbor. The number of trained hands had gone past 40, and I had personally taught 6 of them, and Bell had taught the other 30-odd. And the country began to come apart in a way nobody had planned for, including me.
Understand what a shed was worth as a fact. A house with a woman in her cellar was a house you could squeeze. Marriages were arranged around it. Debts were called in the 9th year of somebody's shed and forgiven in the 90th. There was a whole quiet profession of men like Perrin Ask whose entire living was knowing which of the great families was soft this decade and selling that to the other ones. Now a shed was 3 weeks in a warm room with a girl from the yard. Bell worked out why it had got so fast, because I never had. Asha had your 2 hands on her and mine when you could not stand up, she said, and one man cannot be at the shoulder and the flank in the same hour. A girl in a room has 6 pairs on her at once, 1 to a section, and a row that has been under hot cloth all day is hard by morning, so the next row starts at first light. 2 hands and 2 springs. 12 hands and 3 weeks. I watched a man called Ans Turo, in the market on Kettle Bridge, try to sell a piece of information he had spent 6 years acquiring, and watched the buyer laugh at him, and the seller did not understand what had happened to him and I did. The Farrow house had borrowed against a marriage that was arranged on the assumption that Nessa Farrow would be in a cellar until the year after next. She was walking by the Feast of Thaw. A grain lord out east called Semet Hale had moved 200 men to a border he had chosen because the family on the other side had a shed running. They had 4 sheds running. All 4 of those women stood up inside a year and Semet Hale went home and has been extremely polite ever since. None of that was mine. I did not outthink anybody. I took dead plate off people with a brush and hot water and the world rearranged itself behind me while I was busy. Perrin Ask came back once more, in the autumn, without the hat. He was not buying. He wanted to know, and I could not work out whether he was asking for his principal or for himself, whether it was true that any girl could learn it. Any girl with hands and patience. And how long does it take to make one? About a year to be useful. 2 to be good. He stood in the yard for a while. Then, do you understand what you have done to the price of information in this kingdom? I said I did not think about it much, and he looked at me with something close to pity and went away. 6 weeks later he was working for Kala. The personal part happened in that same autumn, and it belongs in here as much as the money does. Asha and I walked, most evenings. That is all. She could not go into a tavern because of the doorways and I could not afford one anyway, so we walked the wall by the water gate where the wheel turns, and we did it so regularly that people stopped looking. She talked. I talked. She had 81 years of not talking to make up and I had a life I had never described to anybody. There was an evening in the wet end of that autumn when it started raining hard, and she put her arm over me, which is a thing she can do the way you or I would put a hand over a candle, and we stood under it until it passed. Neither of us mentioned it afterward. Both of us thought about it. I know she did, because 2 nights later she went out of her way to mention that dragons do not feel the cold, which was not information anybody had requested. Belle found the whole business hilarious and made it her personal work to be unbearable about it. Marta took a different view, and cornered me by the drying racks, and gave me a short speech about the difference between a woman being grateful and a woman being interested, and warned me not to confuse the two, and then ruined it by adding that in her opinion it was the second one. That is where things stood on the 9th day of the frost month, when Kala came to Brackle. She had not been seen over this city in 91 years. There are people who had built their whole lives here who had never seen a dragon in the air at all. It was late morning. The market on Kettle Bridge was full. And the light went, the way it goes when a cloud crosses, except that it went from the east and it moved. I was in the yard. Belle grabbed my arm hard enough to bruise. Every dog in Chainside started screaming at once and then stopped altogether, which was worse. The shadow came up the river, and it was not the shadow of a bird or a cloud, it was a shape with a shape's edges, and it went over the water gate and over the bridge, and everything under it went quiet in a wave. She came down in the market square, and the stalls went over, and a stack of empty crates went into the river, and a woman selling winter apples out of a basket sat down in the road and did not get up for an hour. I have seen her twice more since and I still cannot describe her properly. You expect the size. Nobody warns you about the color. Every dragon I have ever worked on has been some kind of green or gray or brown, and under all of it, when it comes off, there is that pale apple green like a shoot coming up. Kala is black. Not the black of all under the Kessel house, which is a rot black. A dry black, dulled all over, with a bloom on it like an old kettle, and every plate on her body is the size of a door, and every one of them is welded to the next. She has no seams. That is what I could not stop looking at. A dragon out of the shed has lines all over her, rows and edges, like a fish or a pine cone. She had none. She was one piece. The whole market knelt. Not out of loyalty, and not because anybody told them to. It is a thing that happens in your legs. I did not kneel, and that was not courage, it was that Belle had a fistful of my coat and was holding me up. And Kala put her head down, low, and looked along the front of that crowd, and she spoke, and her voice was not loud. That is what stays with me. She did not need to be loud. I am looking for the boy from the scale yard. Nobody moved. It was the longest 4 seconds of my life, and about 100 people knew exactly where I was standing, and not one of them turned their head. Then a man near the front, a carter I did not know and never found, called out that the boy was on chainside at the vats. And Kala said, in the same quiet voice, that she would wait, and that somebody should go and fetch him, and that she hoped the apples were not ruined because she had knocked the basket over, and that was rude of her. That is how she does it. That is the whole art of her, and I did not understand it until I was walking down the middle of Kettle Bridge with 1,000 people watching me and my legs going soft under me. She is never cruel in front of anybody. She apologizes for the apples. She had them clear the square, which took a while, and she was patient about it, and she thanked a man for moving a cart. Then it was the two of us and about 400 people watching from windows and roofs, and a dragon the size of a granary lying down in a market so that her head would be nearer my level, which was a courtesy and felt like being placed on a plate. You are smaller than I expected. Everyone says that. She made a sound that was almost certainly a laugh. Then she told me her name, which everybody in the square already knew, and asked me for mine, which nobody had ever bothered with. Kess. Kess of where? Kess of nowhere. I came off a boat. That was the first lie I told her, and she knew it was a lie and let it stand, and I understood that she was going to let a great many things stand and that this was not generosity. Describe to me what you do. I described it. All of it, plainly, in about 2 minutes, the way I would to a new girl at the yard. Heat. Time. Oil. The edge from the top down. Never pull. The rows in order and the row above harden first. The rel rules, by name. I did not hold anything back, and Belle shouted at me about it for a week afterward. There was nothing to hold back. That is the whole point of the thing. A secret you can explain in 2 minutes to a stranger in a market is not a secret, it is a habit, and Belle herself had told me that on a step with a heel of bread in her hand. Kala listened to all of it without moving. Then, does it hurt? It does not. She was quiet for a long moment, and then she asked the same question again in a slightly different way, which is the only time in the whole of this that I ever caught her being human. The women you have done. When the plate comes away. What is it like for them? I thought about Asha with her palm flat on a hand's width of new scale in a dark cellar. It is like the itch stopping. Kala put her head down on the cobbles. Then she made her offer, and it was better than anything Perrin Ask had brought me and better than anything I had ever imagined for myself, and it took her about a minute. Every cellar in the kingdom. Not the work, the say. Every house with a woman in her shed would apply to me, and I would decide the order, and the season, and the terms. No house would dare to move without it, because she would stand behind the arrangement and nobody argues with her about anything. I would have a house, and hands under me, and the whole of a trade that did not exist 3 years ago, and I would be, in every way that mattered, the man who knows. And I would be rich in a way that Chainside does not have a word for. One condition: the rooms close. That was all she wanted. The shed rooms shut. The work goes back behind doors, by appointment, quietly, house by house, the way surgery is done. No woman comes up any stairs into a courtyard in daylight in front of 40 people ever again. And what happens to the ones nobody applies for? You will find, she said, that they are applied for. Families are ashamed. Shame is the most reliable engine there is. It never sleeps and it never asks for wages. I asked her why she cared. And she gave me an answer, and I have never been able to decide what to do with it, and I have been carrying it around ever since. She was hatched, she said, in a place that has a different name now, and when she was 200 years old she watched her mother shed. Her mother went down in a hill fort in the old way, in the open, with her own people around her, because in those days there was no shame in it at all. It was a season, like a harvest. There were songs about it. Men came in the 9th year. Not an army. 11 men with long spears and a cart. They knew where she was because everybody knew where she was, and they knew what year she was in because everybody knew that too, and they came up the hill on a wet morning and they did it in about 4 hours. And then they took the plate off her with hooks, said Kala, and sold it, and I have seen the shield. I did not have anything to say to that. She kept going. She had clearly not spoken about it in a long time and it came out of her in order, like something rehearsed in private. Everything you think I did to my people, I did after that. I stopped shedding, which took 800 years to be sure of and hurts every single day and will kill me one day in a manner I do not care to discuss. I made it shameful. I did that on purpose, and I did it slowly, and I did it by never once being weak in front of anybody for 2,000 years, until every mother in this country hid her daughter without needing to be told. You believe I built a throne. I built a wall. And behind that wall, in this kingdom, in 1,200 years, not one woman of my kind has been killed in her shed. Not one. Then she looked at me and asked, quite reasonably, how many I thought would be dead by the end of the year now that every carter between here and the coast knows that a shed is 3 weeks in a warm room. I did not have a good answer for her. I stood in that market with my mouth open and I could not find the flaw in it, because there is no flaw in it. She is right and she is still wrong, and it took me the rest of that winter to work out where the seam is, and I found it in the end in the same place I find everything, which is under the plate. But that day, in the square, all I had was one small hard fact, and I gave it to her because it was all I had. Your wall has a cellar under it. There is a woman under the Kessel house who has been in the dark for 241 years and she is not alive in any way you would want to be. You put her there and you feed her and you visit her. Kala did not deny it. She did not even blink. All is the price, she said. There is always a price and it is always one person and they are always somebody I know. And then, because I was young and frightened and had nothing left, I told her the other thing. The thing about the plate. I told her that new scale comes in harder than old. That I had taken a picking hook to a hand's width of fresh plate on Asha Vale's shoulder and put my shoulder behind it and the hook rang and the plate did not mark. I told her that every woman who comes out of a shed room comes out harder than she went in, and that after 3 or 4 sheds, over 3 or 4,000 years, the difference is not small. And I watched 2,300 years of absolute certainty go still. She had not known. That is what I understood, standing there, and nothing I worked out afterward ever mattered as much. She had refused her shed at 1,000 years old, before anybody in the world had ever seen a properly finished one, and she had spent 13 centuries getting harder and heavier in her one welded suit and being told by everyone that she was the hardest thing alive. And the reason nobody had ever compared her to a fresh plate is that nobody in this kingdom had seen a fresh plate in 1,200 years, because she had personally arranged for them all to happen in cellars in the dark, and then be scraped up as grit and boiled into carter's jerkins. She was the strongest creature on this side of the water. And she had absolutely no idea whether that was still true. She did not shout. I have wondered since whether it would have been better if she had. She got up. She thanked me for my time. She mentioned, in a friendly way, that she had known Ivy and Vale since the girl was a hatchling on a rug, and that the Vale house had always had far too many stairs in it for a family of that size. Then she gave me until the thaw to think about her offer, and went up off the market square, and the wind of it took every awning on Kettle Bridge and put a fishing boat on the steps of the mill. The woman with the winter apples never did get up and sell them. Her name is Hulabrack and she is still on that corner. Somebody bought the whole basket off her out of pity, and the story of the apples went round the city for a month, and I have heard it since from 3 people who were not there. I got back to Chainside and was sick behind the pressing shed, and Belle held my coat and did not make one joke about it, which is how I know how bad I looked. I did not sleep that night, and around the 4th hour I walked up to the Vale house and down the 19 stairs, and the shed room was full. That was the other thing about that winter. It was always full. 6 women in that room at once, on pine boards, with lamps and stoves and girls in aprons and the whole place smelling of hot oil and wet linen and steam. It sounded like a bathhouse. That is what nobody ever expects. There was a woman singing. Asha was working the near end with her sleeves rolled up, doing a shoulder plate on the mother of a fishmonger called Sarnorty, and she was better at it than I was, because of course she was, because she has hands that hold heat and 81 years of knowing exactly where it hurts. She looked up. She saw my face. She put her brush down and got the other girl to take her place, and we went out to the yard door, and I gave her the whole of it. When I got to the part about the hook and the new plate, she sat down on the step. You told her that? I told her that. Cass. She has been the hardest thing alive for 1300 years, and you have just informed her, in a market, in front of the city, that a 19-year-old with a brush can make somebody harder than she is in 3 weeks. I know. She is going to have to find out whether it is true. That is the sentence. Asha put it there on the step in the cold at the 4th hour of the morning while I sat next to her being useless, because Kala had exactly 2 ways to find out. She could shed 2,300 years of welded plate, 3 sheds packed under it, in front of somebody, with her mouth open on a floor. That is the thing she had spent 13 centuries making certain no dragon would ever be seen doing. Or she could make absolutely sure that nobody ever finished a shed in daylight again, so that the comparison could never be made, and everybody would go on believing what they had always believed, including her. It took her about 6 weeks to choose, and she chose the second one, and she did not send a single soldier to do it. She sent a story. The story was true. That is why it worked. It went like this. The yard method kills. Ask the pharaohs. Ask what happened to Nessa Pharaoh in her own cellar, 6 days of fever and dark blood, and the only reason she is alive is that an old picking family came in at midnight and put back what a girl with a brush had pulled apart. Every word of that is accurate. I could not deny one syllable of it. I had been in that room. It was my fault. Paranask did not invent anything. He simply went from house to house being extremely fair, and he always gave both sides, and he always mentioned the pine wedges, and he always let the family reach their own conclusion in their own drawing room. That is how you do it properly. You never lie. You just carry the truth to exactly the right doors. By the end of that frost month, 3 of the 4 Brackhold rooms had lost half their houses. The room on the North Road shut. The one in Hesk shut, and the girl who ran it, whose name was Corin and who was 20, came back to Chainside and would not talk to anybody for a week. And then, in the 2nd week of the new year, a woman died. Her name was Igra Sant. She was 260 years old, and she was the aunt of Van Sant, the man with the hat who had given me his sister's daughter Tellis in exchange for a year of work. Tellis did not kill her. I want to put that down plainly because Tellis Sant believes to this day that she did. What happened is that the Sant mill had a bad autumn, and the family wanted the room and the house back before the spring, and they pushed her. She went down the flank taking every other plate exactly the way Pel Pharaoh had, and she did it because she was 19 and being shouted at by her uncle. The difference is that Hesarel was in Hesk that week putting a room back together and did not get there until the 9th day. I was at the Sant house on the 11th. There was nothing to do at the Sant house on the 11th. Van Sant sat on the step of his own mill with his hat in his hands, and he did not shout at me, and he did not blame his niece, and he apologized to me. He apologized to me, twice, for wasting my time. I have never in my life wanted so badly for somebody to hit me. Tellis Sant left the trade that week. She came back to it 4 years later and is better than any of us now and teaches in the capital, but she left it that week, and she walked to Chainside in the rain to give me her brushes back, and I could not make her keep them. And by the end of that month there were 9 rooms shut, and one of them was ours. Not the Vale cellar. The Vale cellar stayed open the whole way through. The one that shut was the room at the yard. Hask shut it. He shut it in the afternoon, with the stove still lit, and he did it standing in the door of the pressing shed with his thumbs in his belt, explaining to 40 people that a man has to think about his own gate, and there had been talk. There had been talk. He had been paid. I found out later exactly how much, and it was less than I would have guessed, which has always stung. And that is how, in the middle of that winter, I watched a family come up the road to the Vale house with a litter and take a woman back down into a cellar. The Yellick house, 3 streets over, up by the Bracken gate. Their mother, 190 years old, 6 plates from finished. 6. She could have walked out into her own courtyard by the Feast of Thaw. Her sons came for her because of the story, and because a cousin of theirs had a debt with a house that had a debt with somebody who had spoken to Paranask, and by the time it reached the Ellick sons it was not a bribe at all, it was simple family caution. She did not fight them. That is what I could not get out of my head afterward. She thanked the girls in the room, and she let her sons put her on the litter, and she went home to a cellar that had a bar on the outside of the door, and the whole way out she was apologizing for the trouble. Because it is not a law. There has never been a law about any of it. It is shame, and Kala was right about shame. It never sleeps and it never asks for wages. Belle got drunk that night for the first and only time in the whole of our acquaintance and told me a number of things about myself that were accurate. The main one was this. You keep saying it is a method and not a gift, and you are right, and a method has to have a limit written into it or it is just a knife you handed to a child. Then she was sick in the river and I walked her home to Marta and got shouted at by 2 women instead of 1, which was fair. Here is where I was, at the bottom of that winter. 40-odd trained hands and nowhere for most of them to work. 1 dead woman. 1 girl who had left the trade. A yard shut against me by a man who took half of everything I ever earned. An offer from the oldest living creature on this side of the water, still standing, waiting for the thaw, which would make me rich and safe and would put every cellar in the kingdom under my hand and would end all of this by tomorrow afternoon. And a hard fact I could not argue with, which is that 11 men with long spears once walked up a hill on a wet morning and killed a dragon in her shed because everybody knew where she was. I went and sat with Ott. He was making brushes in the drying shed with a stove going, because Hask had shut the room but had not managed to work out how to stop an old man with one hand from sitting in his own shed. He was 70 that winter, and in 2 years I had never once seen him afraid of anything. I gave him the whole thing. The offer, the story, the Elik woman, Igrasant, all of it. He worked the whole time. Bristle, glue, bind, trim. At the end of it he wanted to know one thing, and it was not the thing I expected. The great one. Kala. Does she believe her own reason? She does. That is the problem. She is not lying about the men with the spears. Ott nodded for a while. Then he put the brush down and held up his stump, which he had never once done in front of me, and which the whole yard had been carefully not looking at for 2 years. Everyone at Chainside will tell you my hand went in a vat. It did not? It did. And there was a vat, and there was grit in it, and there was a yard on this river at all, for one reason. 100 houses in this city needed somebody to quietly take away the leavings of a thing they were ashamed of. He picked the brush back up. She kept your women out of the reach of men with spears for 1200 years, said Ott. And it cost my hand, and it cost the woman under the Kessel house everything there is, and it cost this whole street a living made out of boiling up other people's shame. That is a debt somebody else is paying so that she does not have to, and calling it a wall does not change whose hand went into the vat. What broke the winter open was none of that. It was Ivy and Vale, 4 days later, and it was the last thing I expected. She sent for me. Not to the small hall. To the counting room at the back, where there was 1 chair and a table and a window with a view of the wall. Revan Mar had gone to his family's house on the coast 10 days before. The Mars had asked for him. It had been put very warmly, and it was about his mother's health, and everybody involved understood exactly what it was. Ivian was not upset about her husband. She was upset about something else and it took her a while to get to it, and when she did she put it on the table in front of me in 1 sentence. She has been to see me twice. Kala? Once at the beginning of the frost month, and once the night before last. She comes at supper. She is extremely pleasant. She talks about my grandmother, whom she knew, and about the mill, and then she goes. And what does she want? She wants nothing, said Ivian. That is the entire technique. She wants nothing at all, and she comes back, and after the 3rd time you find you have started arranging your own affairs to suit a person who has never asked you for anything. She looked out the window for a while. The 2nd time, she mentioned that my sister works in a cellar in an apron in front of the whole city. She was not angry about it. She was sorry for me. Is it very hard for the family? And I sat in my own counting room, said Ivy and Vale, and I heard myself agree with her. I did not have anything to give that woman. I sat there. Then she did the thing that changed the shape of the year, and she did it in the flat voice of somebody who has decided to spend money she cannot spare. I have held this house for 80 years by never once standing in front of anything, she said. I bend. It is what I am for. If I stop bending, this family goes under in a season and 400 people who eat because of me stop eating. I know. Yes. So this is not bravery. Write that down somewhere. This is a woman doing her arithmetic and finding out that the number comes out the other way for once. She reached under the table and put a bundle in front of me, wrapped in sacking, and it was heavy, and it clinked. The keys to the north cellar. The old grain vault under the west range, which is bigger than the shed room and dryer, and which the family had not opened in 60 years. Take it. Put every girl in it who has nowhere to work. Put the Hesk one and the North Road one in all of them. And put my sister's name over the door, because mine is worth nothing at the moment and hers is worth a great deal. Why? Because my sister asked me for one room, said Ivian, and I have spent 4 months waiting for her to ask me for the second one, and she is too proud to and I am too proud to offer it, and we are going to be old women one day and I would rather not spend it like this. She stood up. She was done. She was extremely uncomfortable and wanted me out of her counting room immediately. And then she said the sentence that I have kept, out of everything anybody said to me in that whole terrible winter. I kept her in a hole for 11 years to save this house. I am not going to spend the rest of my life being the woman who did that twice. The north vault under the west range of the Vale House is 90 feet long and it was built to hold grain against a siege that never came. It took 19 days to make it into a room. I know exactly who did it, because I have never stopped being surprised by how many people turn up when there is finally somewhere to put them. Ott made the brushes. A carpenter called Sim Fowler, who had cut the pine wedges in the Faro cellar at midnight and had been thinking about it ever since, laid a floor and would not take money for the first half of it. A cooper named Basque and he built us 14 soaking tubs and charged full price and was right to. Marta took the wash and ran it like a barracks. A soap boiler off Snell Street called Widow Course worked out a soft soap with no lye bite in it and would not tell anybody the recipe, which infuriated Belle and amused me. The oil came from a man named Ovid Rask who imported it for lamps and who tripled his trade that year and sent Asha a barrel every midwinter until he died. There was a cat. Nobody knows whose. Belle called it plate and it slept on the warm stones by the stove and bit anybody who touched it except Hesserel, who it adored, which everybody found very funny except Hessa. And over the door, in whitewash, in letters a foot high, done by a sign painter called Neb who did the fronts of taverns and had never done anything else in his life, was the name Ashaya Vale. She hated it. She stood in the yard and looked at it and went red from the collarbone up, and Ivian, watching from the top step, enjoyed herself more than she had in 80 years. Now the hard business, which is what we did about the story. Because a story does not die because you are angry at it. Idra Sant was dead, and no amount of shouting at Perrin Ask was going to make her less dead, and the Yellick woman was in her cellar with a bar on the door because of an argument I had lost. We did 3 things that winter. Belle worked out the first, I worked out the second, and Hesserel forced the third down our throats, and only one of the 3 was clever. The first was the mark. Nobody works in a room without a rel mark. Not one hand, not one plate, not for anybody. To get the mark you go to Hessa on Marrow Row and you learn the limits before you ever learn the taking, and she tests you herself, and she has failed people. She failed Corin of Hesk twice, and Corin runs the biggest room in the capital now and puts it about that she was failed twice, on purpose, because it is the best advertisement any of us have. The mark is a piece of pine with 3 burned lines in it and it is worth nothing and there is no law behind it and it has never once been enforced by anybody with a sword. But a family paying for hands asks for it now, and the reason they ask for it is the second thing we did, which is that we published the deaths. That was mine. It is the only genuinely clever thing I have ever done and I got it from an old life where I once watched a bathhouse 2 streets over get shut for a season because it hit a case of the eye rot for 6 days. Every death, every bad flank, every fever, out loud, in the room, in the open, with the name of the hand who did it and the name of the house that pushed her. Van Sant himself stood in the north vault in front of 90 people in the first week and gave his own account of what he had done to his aunt and what he had shouted at his niece. Nobody made him. He asked to. That is a terrible thing to ask of anybody and it worked because Perrin Ask had nothing left to carry from door to door. You cannot frighten a house with a secret that is painted on a wall. The third thing was Hess's, and it cost me a great deal, and she was right. I had to stop working, not the teaching. The hands. She came to the vault in the second month with her satchel and stood over me while I was doing a rib plate on a woman from the fishing quarter and she watched me for about 40 minutes and then she waited until I was finished and took me outside. Your right shoulder does not lift past here. It lifts enough. It lifts enough on a rib plate on a small woman on a good day. What does it do on hour 6 of a shoulder plate on somebody the size of the lady of this house? I did not have an answer. Who put a hook in your shoulder? You did. And who is going to be standing over the woman you kill in about a year, putting pine in her flank at midnight? So I stopped. I did 4 or 5 a month after that and only the easy ones, and I taught, and I ran the schedules and the oil and the tubs and the arguments, and I was 30 and finished as a working hand and I did not take it well. Asha found me in the yard about a week into it, sulking in a way I would like to be able to deny. She sat down on the mounting block, which put her head roughly level with mine standing up, and she wanted to know what exactly I thought I had lost. I told her the work was the only thing I actually had. And she said, without any particular sympathy, that she had spent 81 years being the thing that other people did work on, and that if I wanted to swap she would think about it. Then, in a different voice, do you remember what you were in the other life? A man in a tile room with a mitt. And how many were there like you in that city? Hundreds. Every bathhouse on the river had 2 or 3. Then she put her hand on the back of my neck, which she had never done before, and she left it there, and she said the thing I actually needed. Hundreds of hands in one city was the entire point. A man who is the only one who can do a thing is not a craftsman, he is a seller. I did not have a clever answer. I sat there and let her hand stay where it was. That is as much of that as I am going to put in. Now, I had been going down that pipe every 10 days for a year and a half by then, with a lamp and a chair and news, and I had never once put a brush on her, and both of us knew exactly why and neither of us had ever said it. 2 sheds welded into one shell. 241 years of it. The dead layer on her was not 1 plate thick, it was 3, and the top 2 had grown together across the seams so there were no edges at all, and where there were no edges there was nothing to lift. I could not do it. Belle could not do it. Nobody who had ever lived could do it, because nobody had ever tried, because in the entire history of the world nobody had ever been left in a hole long enough for it to be necessary. So we did what you do. We got everybody into a room and we argued for 3 days. There were 9 of us in the North Vault that week. Belle, Hesse, Asha, Telesant, who had come back for exactly this and nothing else. Corin of Hesk. Pelfaro, who had made the worst mistake any of us ever made and had spent 2 years earning her way back to that table. Wexel came from Kettle Bridge, deaf in one ear, with 3 tools he had made on spec and a theory. And Ott sat at the end with his stump on the table and said nothing for 2 days and then solved it. The problem, in plain words. Heat and time lift an edge. There is no edge. If you cut one, you cut into her, and she is 241 years past being able to heal anything. Wexel's theory was that you could find the old seams under the welding by sound, the way you find a flaw in a casting, tapping across the surface and listening for the note to change. He was right, and it took 7 weeks to map her, and the map was drawn in chalk on all herself, on her own back, by a girl with a hammer the size of a spoon, and I'll lay there through all of it and made jokes about being a wall. Hesse's part was the order. 3 sheds packed together means 3 rows of new plate under there, each one leaning on the one above, and if you took the shell off in one go the whole thing would come away and she would have nothing on her at all. So it had to come off in bands. Top down, 1 band a month, and each band had to sit and harden in the air for 4 weeks before the next came off, and that meant 14 months, and it meant somebody in that cellar every single day for 14 months. Ott's part was the heat. The trouble, he said, is that you cannot get a cloth hot enough for that shell and you cannot keep it hot long enough, and if you use a stove down there you will cook her. Then he described, in about 6 sentences, a thing that anybody who has ever seen a bathhouse would recognize instantly and that nobody in that room had ever seen in their lives. Steam. Not cloths. A closed room, a stove outside it, a pipe in through the wall, and the whole space full of wet heat for 8 hours at a time, with the women lying in it and the dead layer drinking the whole while. I sat there while a one-handed brush maker from a scale yard invented the steam room, and I did not say a single word, because I had spent 6 years of another life inside one and it had genuinely never crossed my mind. That is what happens when you tell 40 people how a thing works. Somebody who is not you thinks of the obvious. We opened the Kessel cellar properly in the spring. Not through the pipe. Through the front of the house, because the house belonged to nobody in Ivy and bought it for 7 gold from a merchant's widow in Hesk who had forgotten she owned it. 7 gold. For the building where the oldest crime in this kingdom had been kept in the dark for 241 years. And on the 9th day of the working, when the first band came off All's shoulders and neck and the pale green came up under it in the lamplight for the first time since the year of the flood, she asked us all to stop for a moment. Nobody knew why. Then we heard it too. Upstairs, in the empty house above, somebody had come in through the front door and was walking, slowly, across the boards. Calla had come for the spring visit. She came down the Kessel stairs in the shape she wears indoors, which is a woman about 12 feet tall who has to come down a staircase sideways, and she stopped 4 steps from the bottom and looked at what we had done to her room. 40 lamps. 2 stoves outside the wall with pipes through it. 12 people in aprons. Wet linen on a line. A cat asleep on the warm stones. And all of the Kessel house, up on her elbows, with 241 years of black shell off her shoulders and neck, and the new plate under it pale as a shoot, steaming gently in the lamplight. Nobody spoke. Belle had a brush in her hand and did not put it down, which I have always thought was the bravest thing anybody did that year. "Good evening," Calla said, to the room. Then she went down the last 4 steps and crossed to Wall and stood over her, and she looked at that new plate for a long time, and I watched her look at it, and I would give a great deal to know what went through her. Then she asked the question. The same one, in the same words, the way she had asked it every spring for 241 years. "Oh. Is shedding a private thing?" And Ull, propped on one elbow, with her neck bare to the air for the first time since the year of the flood, in a room with 12 witnesses and a cat, gave her the same answer she had given every year since before my grandmother's grandmother was born. "No." Calla nodded, the way you nod at a stubborn child. Then she looked around the room, and she found me, and she gestured at all of it, the lamps, the stoves, the pipes, the aprons, and she wanted to know one thing. "How long?" 14 months. "And how many hands?" 12 regular. 18 who come. 30 people, she said, for 14 months, for one woman who will never be any use to anybody. That is the difference between us. I would not spend it. You would not have to spend it if you had not put her here. That was Hessa Rell, from the back, with her arms folded, and she said it in exactly the voice she uses on 19-year-olds who go down the flank out of order. Calla turned her head. I have never seen 40 people go that still. I have been in a cellar with a dragon who could not stand, and I have been in a market square when a shadow came up the river, and neither of those was like the 4 seconds after Hessa Rell opened her mouth. And Calla said, mildly, and this is exactly what she said, that she knew Hessa's family, and that a Rell had picked for her mother's household 800 years ago. They had always been people who worked with their hands and said what they thought, and she had a great deal of time for them. Then she came over to me, and she put her offer one more time, and she made it worse by being reasonable. The rooms could stay open. That was the new part. She had thought about it, apparently, all winter, and she had come to a position, and the position was that the work is good and the daylight is the problem. Do it in the rooms. Do it in the vaults. Do it with your steam and your pine and your brushes, and let every woman in this kingdom come out of her shed in 3 weeks instead of 100 years. And close the doors. No courtyards. No sign painters. No woman standing in the sun in front of her whole household while a boy drops the kindling. Nobody outside the trade ever knows which house has who and when. And she pointed out, accurately, that this would give me almost the entire thing I wanted, and that the only thing she was asking me to give up was the one that did not save a single life. Why does the door matter so much to you? Because in 1200 years, she said, the only thing that has ever killed one of us is a man knowing where to stand and when. And I stood in that cellar and gave her the answer I had spent the whole winter finding, and it is not a clever answer and it did not come out well, and I have improved it in my head about 400 times since. What I said was this. There is a yard on Chainside with 9 vats in it. For 200 years that yard boiled the leavings of your women into cheap plate for carters, and every man in Brackhold who could not afford steel wore somebody's grandmother on his back. Nobody thought anything of it, and no one on that river ever once called it a shame, because nobody knew where it came from. You did not make it private. You made it invisible. Those are different, and one of them is a wall and the other one is a hole with a woman in it, and there is one of those under my feet right now. Calla listened to all of it. Then, are you finished? I said I was, and she went back to the stairs. And on the second step she stopped and turned round, and she said one more thing, and it was not to me. It was to the room, and it was almost gentle. You are all very sure that the daylight is safe because it has been safe for 3 years. I have been keeping it safe for 1200. When it goes wrong you will not have 1200 years to fix it, and I would like it noted that I did ask. Then she went up. And that is when I saw it. She was going up the Kessel stairs sideways, because of the width, and that put the whole left side of her neck in the light of the 40 lamps for about 2 seconds. There was a line. Just under the jaw, where the neck plates run into the small ones behind the ear. A line, about the length of my hand, where the edge of one plate stood proud of the one beside it. Lifted. I have looked at that particular joint on 900 women. I have taken plate off that exact spot more times than I can count, and I have taken it off Asha, whose neck plates are the hardest ones on her, and I know what a lifted edge looks like from across a room in bad light. The plate on Calla's neck was lifting. 1300 years past due and welded into one piece from her jaw to her tail, and her body had started anyway, because bodies do not care what you have decided about yourself. I did not move and I did not make a sound. She went up the stairs and across the boards and out of the front door of the house she had been visiting for 241 years. And in the doorway, without turning round, in a voice that only carried because the room had gone completely silent, she said, "Good evening to you all," and something else that I did not catch and Belle did. Belle wrote it down that night because she did not want to get it wrong. What Calla said was, "You are the first person in a very long time who has looked at me properly." She knew. Of course she knew. She had known for months, and she had come to this cellar, on the one night of the year when she could be sure I would be in it, and she had gone up those stairs sideways with the lamps on her left side. That took me 2 days to understand, and I have never quite forgiven her for it. She did not come to threaten me. She came to be seen. Asha and I walked the whole way back along the river that night. It took an hour because she goes slowly when she is thinking. "I want to be sure," she said. "Describe it again." I described it again. The length of it. The direction of the lift, which was up and back toward the spine. The color of the line, which was dark and wet. Then she stopped walking, and put her hand on the wall, and asked me a question that told me she had already worked out the whole thing. Was there any pail under it? None. Not a thread. She stood there for a while with her hand on the stones. She gave it to me there on the wall, slowly and in order, and she was the only person alive who could have told me. When a shed starts, the dead plate lifts and the new plate comes up underneath, and the two things happen together. Always. One does not happen without the other. The lift is the new plate pushing, unless there is no new plate. If a body has been holding a shed down for long enough, the new plate does not wait forever. It grows in, it packs down, it gets no room, and eventually it stops being a plate at all. It goes hard and it goes flat and it fuses to the meat and to the dead shell above it, and the whole lot becomes one thing. Bone, Asha said. Near enough to bone. And bone does not lift and bone does not shed. So what is lifting? The shell, she said. Only the shell. It is coming off her because it is dead, and everything dead comes off in the end. And there is nothing under it. I stood on the wall by the water gate at midnight and did the arithmetic out loud, and Asha let me do it, because she had already done it and she wanted me to get there myself. The shell lifts. It cannot be stopped, because it is 2,300 years old and it is finished. It will lift a hand's length a month, then faster, all over her at once, in the open, in front of everybody. And under it, no new plate. Nothing to close over. Just a very old woman coming apart in the air, in daylight, where everyone can see, which is the single thing she has spent 13 centuries making certain would never happen to anybody. How long? A year, Asha said. Perhaps 2. And every day of it she will be softer than the woman in your vault who came out last week, and she will know it, and so will everybody else. Then she asked me the question that I have never really answered, and she asked it standing on a wall with the wheel going round below us and her hands still on the stones. Cass. When she comes to you, and she will come to you, are you going to help her? I did not answer her that night. I said I did not know, which was true, and we walked home, and I did not sleep, and in the morning there was a band to take off all, and the question went where questions go when there is work. 14 months. 1 band a month, top down, 4 weeks of hardening between each, and somebody in that cellar every single day. I do not remember all of it. I remember pieces. I remember the 3rd band, which came off across her chest, and the sound the whole room made, because until that band nobody had actually seen how big she is. I remember the 7th, in the deep of winter, when the pipe from the outside stove froze at 4 in the morning and Sim Fowler the carpenter slept in the Kessel house for 6 nights running with his boots on so that it would not happen twice. I remember Plate the cat having kittens in the linen basket, which was a disaster, and 2 of them going to the sandhouse, and 1 of them going to Wexel, who pretended to be furious about it and named it Chisel. I remember all learning to talk again properly. The words were all there. It was the pace that had gone. She had spent 241 years speaking to no one but a frightened boy with a tray and a dragon who came once a year to ask a question, and she had got slow, and by the 4th month she was fast and dry and extremely funny and could take Belle apart in 3 sentences. I remember her asking Hesse, in the 9th month, what had happened to Maurice and Kessel, and Hesse telling her, and the 2 of them sitting in that cellar for a long time afterward, one of them 9 years old at the time and one of them under the floor when it happened. And I remember the 10th month, when the bands got down past her hips and Asha started doing the heat herself for 8 hours at a stretch, because by then nothing else was hot enough for what was left. Then it was done. It finished on an ordinary Thursday in the rain month, which I noticed, because I died on an ordinary Thursday and I have a thing about them. There were about 70 people in the Kessel house that day and none of us had planned it, which is how it works when a thing has been going for 14 months and everybody has been counting. The last band came off her tail and Belle lifted it away, and Elle lay there for a moment, and then she got her legs under her and stood up in that cellar for the first time since the year of the flood. Her head went into the dark above the lamps. And then, because the Kessel cellar was built by river people who did not think about doors, we had to spend 2 hours taking the front of the house apart with hammers to get her out of it. I want that in the record, because everybody remembers the flight and nobody remembers that we knocked a wall down first. She came out of the Kessel house into a street in the middle of the afternoon. There were maybe 400 people on that street by then. Somebody had run and told somebody. Neb the sign painter was up on a roof. The woman with the winter apples was there, 3 years older and considerably better at getting out of the way. All of the Kessel house stood in the road, and she was the color of a green apple from her jaw to her tail, and there was not a mark on her anywhere. And Wexel of Kettle Bridge, who had come with 3 tools and no plan and had been standing there for an hour with his mouth open, walked up to the oldest woman in the kingdom, in front of 400 people, and asked whether he might tap her. She let him. He went along her flank with a little hammer, listening, and his face did the thing it did the first time he saw a whole plate, and then he sat down in the road. Then he got up and did something that has become the most famous half-hour in the history of this city, and it was not planned, and it very nearly went wrong. He sent a boy to his shop for a crossbow and 2 plates. One was a sheet of pressed grit, the cheap grey kind, out of the chainside vats, the sort of thing every carter in Brackhold wears. The other was a piece of Asha Vale's third-year shoulder plate that she had given him for tools. He set them both against the Kessel wall and he shot the grit sheet at 20 paces and it went through like a biscuit, which surprised nobody. Then he shot the shoulder plate and the bolt came off it and went into the road, and there was a noise from 400 people that I still hear sometimes. And then Ull, who had been watching all of this with an expression I can only call amused, put out one forearm against the wall next to the plates and asked him to shoot her. He would not. He absolutely would not. And there was a long argument in the road, and she won it the way she wins everything, by being extremely patient and slightly rude. He shot her forearm at 20 paces. The bolt broke. Not bounced. Broke, in 2 pieces, and the head of it went up in the air and came down in a gutter and a boy called Tamelik picked it up and his family still has it. There was no mark on her at all. There was not even a dull spot. 3 sheds worth of new plate, grown in under a shell in the dark over 241 years, all of it come in at once and hardened in the air over 14 months. The woman that Kala put in a hole to prove that shedding is a shameful thing came out of the ground as the hardest living creature anybody in this kingdom has ever measured. And then she flew. She went up off the Kessel Street with 2 beats and took a chimney off with her tail, and about a quarter of the city saw it, and the ones who did not see it heard about it within the hour from somebody who had. She was not graceful. 241 years is a long time not to fly, and she came down twice in the water meadows on the far bank and had to be helped up by a farmer called Loon Fairy who has told the story at every wedding since. But she went over Brackhold in the afternoon light, green as a shoot, and every dog in Chainside screamed at once and then stopped, and I stood in a street full of people looking up, and I did not feel triumphant. I felt the thing you feel when something you started stops belonging to you and starts belonging to everybody. Now Hask. He came to me 6 days after Ull flew, and that hour has stayed with me longer than the flight has. He came to the North Vault in the last hour of a working day, when the room was nearly empty. He had his sleeves down, which he always did. He had been wearing his sleeves down in high summer for 2 years and I had never once wondered why. Could he have a private word? So we went out to the yard door and stood where I had stood with Asha, and he rolled up his left sleeve. From wrist to elbow, his arm was plaited. Gray, thick, in rows, dull as a stone, and lifted at the edges in about 7 places, and under the lifted edges it was wet. I put my thumb on one and he made a sound like a man being lowered onto something. Yard hide. Every old man on Chainside has a patch of it somewhere, on the forearms or across the shins, and everybody had always assumed it was a burn or a rash or just what happens to men who stand in a vat for 30 years. Everyone had it wrong. It is what happens to a man who breathes and handles boiled dragon scale every day for 3 decades. The stuff gets into you and your own skin takes the lesson and starts doing it too, badly, in the wrong places, with nothing underneath. Ott's arm had it under the bandage. So did Piner's shins. So did Kiddo at the presses, and old Tibbet who ran the barrows, and 2 other men I could name, and every one of them had spent years quietly not mentioning it. Hask had it worst because Hask had been in that yard since he was 9. It itched. That is what he wanted me to know, and he had trouble getting the words in the right order. And eventually what he got out was that it had itched every hour of every day for 7 years and that some nights he tied his own hand to the bed frame. I stood there and looked at a man who had put a price of 9 copper on my body, and who had taken half of everything I earned for 2 years, and who had shut my room in the middle of a winter for money, and who had hit me twice behind a pressing shed. And I thought about what to charge him. I want to be honest here. I thought about turning him away. I stood there and I had the sentence ready. What I did instead was put a question to him. What does a scratcher cost on this river? He did not understand at first. Then he did, and his face went, and he stood in his own yard and got it out. 9 copper. Then that is the price. That, in my hand, and you come to the vault on the 2nd day of every month, and you sit on the bench with everybody else and you wait your turn behind whoever got there first. He paid it. He came for 8 months. He sat on that bench between a fishmonger's mother and a girl from the Ellick house, and he waited his turn like anybody, and by the end of it his left arm was skinned. He never thanked me and I never wanted him to. What he did instead, in the 2nd year, was give the yard over. Not to me. He signed Chainside to Watt, in front of Wexel and a wine merchant called Decivale and a rope maker called Bost Hallow, and then he went to his sister on the coast and I have not seen him since. And that is all of that. There was no crowd, no reading, nobody made a speech. He put 9 copper in my hand in a yard at dusk and I put it in my pocket, and it is still in a box on a shelf in my house, and it is the only money I have ever kept. 2 years earlier that same handful had been the entire price of my whole body, once, forever, and every man on that river had heard the number and thought it was reasonable. Same coins. Same yard. Different arithmetic. Which brings me to the autumn, and to Calla, and to the 11 men. Calla was not seen over any city that autumn. That does not sound like much. Understand that she had gone over Hesk on the same week every autumn for longer than the road to Hesk has been paved. Farmers out on the nail flats set their cutting by it, and a man named Osper Lead who kept the ferry at Ford Meadow had never in 60 years failed to see her go north. He came into Brackhold in the frost month to buy rope and mentioned it in the Dog and Ladder, and by the end of that week it was in the Blue Ewe and the Spindle and every other tavern on the river. She has not gone north. Has anybody seen her? Ask at the mill. Ask Neb, he paints the fronts, he sees everything. Nobody has seen her. Paranask turned up at the North Vault a month later looking for work, which took a nerve I have never been able to hold against him. He came in the front, in daylight, and he stood in a room full of women in aprons and steam, and he waited until I was free, and then he offered me his services in the plainest terms I have ever heard a man use about himself. He had spent 19 years knowing which houses were soft. That trade was dead and he knew exactly who had killed it. What he had left was that he knew every family in 3 counties, who owed whom, who hated whom, and who was lying about their aunt. I hired him. Bell did not speak to me for 4 days. He was worth every coin and he stayed 12 years, and he is the reason there is a room in every town between here and the coast instead of only in the places where somebody happened to be brave. And it was Paranask, in the deep of that winter, who came and stood in the doorway of my counting room with his hands behind his back and told me about the men. There were 11 of them, which I did not believe when he said it, and he had to repeat the number twice, and then we both sat with it. He had the names. That was his whole value, and he laid them out for me, and 4 of them I can still say in my sleep. Darrow Vell, who had been a spear captain in the border years and who had not had a command since. A carter out of Hesk called Ib Taro. A man from the capital called Suyet who paid for it all and who has never been proved to have existed. And Marrow Rose own Veshrel, who was Hess's cousin. The Rel name in that list is the one that made me feel sick, and I did not tell Hesse for a week, and she has never entirely forgiven me for the week. Their plan was not clever. It did not have to be. They had been going up onto the hill above Ashen Ford, where Calla has lived since before the ford had a name, and they had been lying in the gorse with a glass, and they had been watching her come out to lie in the sun, and they had been counting the lifted edges. You see the problem. I taught 900 people how to look at a plate. I published it. I stood in a market and described it to the oldest creature on this side of the water in front of 400 witnesses. A lifting edge is dark and wet at the line. It runs up and back toward the spine. It gets longer by about a hand's width a month, and when a woman has more than a few of them, she is coming apart and she cannot fly for long and she cannot burn for long. Any fool with a glass in a month can now read a dragon like a page in a bakery ledger. Calla told me this would happen. She told me in a market square with her head on the cobbles, and I did not have an answer for her then, and standing in my counting room with Paranask reading me 4 names, I did not have one either. I did nothing for 3 days. I want that written down, because people are generous about me now and they should not be. For 3 days I sat with the knowledge that 11 men were lying in the gorse above Ashen Ford, counting the edges on a woman who had put all in a hole for 241 years. The same woman had shut 9 rooms, and had come to Ivy and Vale's supper table to be pleasant about the stairs. And on the 4th night somebody knocked on the yard door of the north vault, and it was the middle of the night, and the room was empty except for me and Belle and a stove. Belle opened it. Calla was standing in the yard in the shape she wears indoors, in a plain grey cloak with the hood back, in the rain, alone. There was no carriage. No people. She had walked in from Ashen Ford, which is 14 miles, because she could not fly it anymore, and her boots were ruined, and she stood in the rain in a scale yard and looked at a girl of 20 with a brush in her hand. Belle did not kneel. She stood in the doorway and asked her a question instead, and it was the right question, and I have never been prouder of anybody. "Are you here as a customer?" And Calla said yes. "Then coming out of the rain," said Belle, and stood back, and that is how the oldest living creature in this kingdom came into a room she had spent 1300 years making sure would never exist. We sent for Hesse. We sent for Asha. Nobody sent for a crowd and nobody woke the house, and there were 4 of us in that vault that night and a cat, and the doors at both ends were shut but not barred, because Asha does not allow a bar on any door in that building. Calla took the cloak off. I have described her as black. In the vault, under 40 lamps, with the steam up, she was not black. She was grey at the edges, the grey of a stone that has been in a fire, and along her jaw and her neck and down both forearms and across her back, the shell stood up in ridges you could put a finger under. It was worse than the Kessel cellar. The Kessel cellar is the worst thing I have ever seen, and this was worse. All was buried. Calla was opening. Hesse walked round her twice with a lamp and did not touch her once, and then she went to the far end of the room and stood with her hands on a tub and her back to us for a while, and when she came back she had her face in order. "How long has it been lifting?" "Since before you were born," Calla said. Then, because Hesse Rell has never once in her life let a thing stand, she wanted a real number, and she got one. 14 years at the jaw. 2 at the shoulder. This winter, everywhere. "Does it hurt?" "Every day for 1300 years, said Calla, and this is not different in kind, only in direction, and she would rather we did not make a thing of it. Then she lay down on the pine boards in the middle of the north vault, on her side, the way 900 women had lain down in that room before her. "Cass, do the neck." We steamed her for 6 hours. Ott's pipe, the outside stove, the whole room white, the 4 of us working in wet shirts. Asha held heat on the jawline the way she had learned to. Belle ran cloths. Hesse mapped and did not speak, and the shell came away like paper. That is the thing I was not ready for, and I should have been, because Asha had explained it to me on a wall at midnight a year and a half before. It was dead. Everything dead comes off if you wait, and this had been dead for a very long time. The first piece off her neck was the length of my forearm, and it lifted with almost no persuading, and it made the wet sheet sound, and Belle took it away in both hands, and underneath there was nothing. No pale green. No rose. No new plate coming up soft as the inside of a lip and steaming faintly in the lamplight the way it had come up under my thumb on Asha's shoulder in a cellar 3 years before. Gray. Flat. Dry. Hard as a floor and the same all over, with no seams anywhere and no give anywhere, and when I put my palm on it, it was cool. Hesse put a fingernail against it, which is the first test any of us learn, and her nail did not turn and it did not catch. There was nothing for it to catch on. I have taken plate off 900 bodies. I have never in my life touched anything on a living creature that felt like a stone step in a churchyard. We worked for another 2 hours to be sure, and we were sure after the first 10 minutes, and Calla lay there and let us be sure because she is a thorough woman. Then she wanted to know, in a perfectly steady voice, what was under her neck. There was one lamp between me and Hesse looked at me, and it was my job, because I was the one who had told her about the hook in a market square. Nothing is under it. It has all gone the same. There is no new plate to come in. It went in and it packed down and it fused and it stopped being scale, and it is bone now, or near enough, from your jaw to your tail. And the shell? The shell is dead and it is coming off, and there is nothing anybody can do to stop that, and there is nothing underneath to close over behind it. She lay on the pine boards in the north vault for a while. Then, can it be put back on? Nothing dead ever goes back on. It does not knit and it is not a lid. I know that, she said. I wanted to hear a man who knows the work say it. Nobody said anything for a long time. The stove ticked. Somewhere at the far end of the room the cat jumped down off a shelf, and then Calla laughed. It was a real laugh, not a bitter one, and it went on for a while, and it is the single strangest thing I have ever heard. 1300 years, she said, of being the hardest thing alive. And I have been walking around inside a wall with nobody in it. Asha put it to her plainly. What do you want to do? And Kala got up off the boards, which took her some time, and she put her cloak on over a neck that was bare gray for a hand's width, and she stood in a room full of steam and lamps and looked at the 3 women in it. I am going to go home, she said. And do not offer me the bench. Nobody had offered. I know. That is why I am saying it before you can. I have spent 1300 years arranging this kingdom so that no one of my kind is ever seen coming apart, and I am not going to spend the end of it sitting between a fishmonger's mother and a girl from a mill. Then she went to the door, and she stopped there the way she always stops, and she gave me the last thing she ever gave me. You want me to concede, she said. You want the old woman to stand in your steam room and admit she was wrong about the doors, and I am not going to, because I am not wrong. 11 men are lying in the gorse above my house tonight counting the edges on my back with a glass, and they can read me because you taught this whole country to read, and everything I told you in that market is going to be true again inside your lifetime. You have simply moved who pays. It used to be all. Now it will be whoever is soft on a bad morning in a bad year, and you will not know her name, and you will not be there. And then, in the doorway, in the rain, the woman who had never once been weak in front of anybody said the only thing in the whole of this that I have never repeated to another living person until now. Cass. Do you know what I actually wanted, at the beginning, before any of it? No, I wanted somebody to come down the hill and help my mother. Then she pulled the hood up and walked out into the rain and started the 14 miles home, and Belle stood in the door and watched her all the way to the corner. I went to all in the morning. She was living at the Kessel house by then, because the front of it was already knocked out and she had got attached to the street, and half of Brackhold had taken to walking past to see whether she was in. She was in. She was lying in the wreck of the front room with her chin on the doorstep and a boy called Tam Ellick reading her the grain prices, which he did every day for a penny and which she claimed to find fascinating. I sent the boy home and gave her the whole of it. The 11 men. The gorse. The glass. Garovel, Ib Taro, the man from the capital who may not exist, Veshrel of Marrow Row, and the night in the vault, and the shell that came off like paper, and the grey floor of a thing underneath it that would not turn a fingernail. All listened to all of it with her chin on the doorstep and her eyes shut, and when I had finished she asked me exactly one question. Does she know they are up there? She knows. Then all of the Kessel house got up, and put her head out through the hole in the front of her own house, and went to Ashenford. She did not tell anybody what she meant to do. She did not tell me. Wexel worked it out about 4 hours later and came running down Kettle Bridge to the vault with no coat on to explain it to me, and by then it was already done. What she did was this. She landed on the hill above Ashenford, in the open, in the middle of a bright cold morning, about 200 paces from where 11 men were lying in the gorse with a glass. And then she lay down in the sun on the south face of that hill, green as a shoot, with the whole of her showing, and went to sleep for a season. Understand what those men were looking at through that glass. They had spent a winter learning to count lifted edges. It was the only skill their whole enterprise was built on. They were extremely good at it by then, and they had in front of them, at 200 paces, in full sun, the single hardest living creature anybody in this kingdom has ever put a crossbow to, with no lifted edge anywhere on her body, asleep, between them and the house. Nothing happened. That is the whole of it. Nobody fought anybody. Ibtaro went back to Hesk within the week and got his cart out again. Garovel stayed 9 days and then went down to the ford and got drunk and told a man named Pole Ferry, brother of the farmer who once helped all up out of a water meadow, exactly what they had been planning, and Pole Ferry told everyone. Veshrel came to Marrow Row and stood in his cousin's kitchen and was in there for 2 hours, and what Hesse did to him in that kitchen I do not know and I have never asked. And the man from the capital stopped paying, because you cannot sell 11 men a dragon in her shed when there is a better dragon asleep on the hill. I asked all afterward why she did it. It took me a year to ask, because I was afraid of the answer, and when I finally did she gave it to me straight off with no thinking, which meant she had been waiting. I did not do it for her. For who, then? For the next one, said all. There is always a next one. I lay in a hole for 241 years because 11 men once walked up a hill in the rain, and now some boy in Hesk is going to lie in a hole for 200 years because 11 men walked up a hill again. Somebody has to stand on the hill until people stop believing it works. Then she put her chin back on the doorstep and said the other thing, and it is the only time I ever heard her sound like the woman who was under that floor. Also, nobody came down the hill for her mother. Somebody should have. Kala lived 4 more years. The shell came off her the whole way through, in the open, in daylight, and everybody saw. It went in sheets and in pieces, and it went slowly, and by the second spring there was not a farmer on the nail flats who could not have described exactly what state she was in. Nothing happened to her. That is what I want to put down, because everyone expects a fall and there was not one. No house moved against her. No spear came up that hill. The men who had wanted to were all somewhere else being embarrassed. What happened is that she stopped mattering. Marriages stopped being arranged around the memory in her head. Houses stopped hiding their daughters out of a habit that nobody could remember starting. Nobody sent for her opinion. Nobody knelt in a market. She had spent 2,300 years making herself into the fixed point that everything else was measured from, and it turned out that the whole arrangement had been standing on one thing only, which was that nobody had ever seen a finished dragon standing next to her. She was not brought down. She was simply put next to all, once, in daylight, by a woman who chose to lie in the sun on a hill. I saw her twice more. The first time was at Ashenford in the 3rd year, and she was outside on the grass, and about a third of her was bare, and she was the color of a paving stone. There was a boy from the village reading her the grain prices, and I am fairly sure he was Tam Elik's cousin, and something all had set up and never mentioned to me. She was civil. She wanted to know how many rooms there were now. I told her, and she did the arithmetic in her head faster than I could have on paper, and she said, that is one in every town of more than 400 people, and I had never worked that out and it was true. Then she wanted to know whether anybody had died that year. 2. She nodded and did not use it against me, which she could have. The second time was the last winter, and she was down by then and could not get up easily, and all had moved onto that hill more or less permanently and was lying about 10 paces off, pretending to sleep. And all asked her the question. In front of me. The same words, the same weight, once a year, for 4 years by then. Kala. Is shedding a private thing? And Kala, with 3/4 of her shell off and her jaw on the grass, said yes, it is, and I have never regretted a day of it, and you are all going to find out. All said, all right, and went back to pretending to sleep, and that is how those two spent the end of it, and I think if you had put them in a room at the beginning of all this they would have been friends. Now the rest of it, quickly, because a man telling his own story goes on too long about the end. Ivy in Vale runs the Vale house and will die running it, and she is the reason there is money in 14 towns that could not have paid for a room on their own. She and Asha still do not talk about the 11 years. What they do instead is have supper on the last day of every month, and neither of them has missed one in 9 years. Revan Mar had one conversation with Asha by the Watergate in the spring after all flew, about 1/4 of an hour, and I have never asked for a word of it. He sent her a barrel of the good Mar cider every midwinter until the year he died. Bell runs the North Vault. Marta has a cottage with a garden on Lamb Lane and a woman called Fan Weaver who does her washing. I have a woman, she tells people at her own gate. Who does my washing? I'd owned Chainside for 6 years and never boiled another sack of grit, and there is a school of hands on that ground now with 40 beds and a curved brush in every one of them that people still call an ot. The rel rules are 9 lines and they hang in every room from here to the sea, and they have been added to twice, both times by Hesse, both times after somebody died. Wexel is dead. He left the shop to a nephew called on Netvask and the crossbow to me, which I think was a joke. And I am 39, and my right shoulder does not lift past here, and I have not done a full body in 11 years. What I do now is teach on the first 3 days of the week and argue with Per and ask about money on the other 4. And once a month I go and sit with somebody who is frightened, because being the man who came down the stairs first is a thing you can still do for people after your hands are finished. Asha and I have been together for 6 years. I am not going to describe it. She is 9 feet tall and I am not, and if you want to know how any of that works, everybody in Brackhold has already asked and they did not get an answer either. I will give you one thing, because it is the best evening of my life and it costs me nothing to hand over. It was the summer after all flew. We were on the wall by the Watergate, which is where everything in my life seems to happen, and the wheel was turning, and she put it to me straight. Would you have come down those stairs if you had known the whole of it in advance? I said no. Which was true. I would have gone to the stables and fed horses and been warm. She thought that was the funniest thing she had ever heard, and she laughed the whole way along the wall, and then she stopped laughing and asked me to put my hand on the plate on her shoulder. The first one. The hand's width. 3rd row in from the neck, the one I took off in 4 hours with a mule brush and a jug of lamp oil when I was 26 and worth 9 copper. It is the oldest new plate on her body. Everything else came after. Does it itch? No. Then that is the only thing I have ever wanted from anybody, she said. And you did it before you knew who I was. Last thing. There is a room under the Vale House with 19 stairs down to it, and there is no bar on the door, and there never will be while anybody in this family is alive. Any morning you like, you can walk in there and find 12 women on pine boards in the steam, and girls in aprons with 3 burn lines on a bit of pine in their pockets. There is a stove, and a cat descended from a cat, and Marta's granddaughter running the wash and taking no nonsense from anybody. Yesterday there was a woman from the fishing quarter whose family have been shrimping off the nail bar for 6 generations and who came in on her own feet with her daughter carrying the bag. 11 days. That is what she came in for. Her mother went down at the same age and came up 84 years later and did not know her own children. And when she was on the boards and the steam was up, she got frightened, the way they all do about the second hour, and she got the question out that all of them get out. Is it going to hurt? No. And a girl of 19 called Sable, from a mill town called Whistlersford that I have never been to, who has never seen a cellar with a bar on it and does not really believe the stories, put a hot cloth on her shoulder and told her no. That is the whole of it. That is what I built, and I did not build most of it, and what I did build took 4 hours in a stone room with a woman who was chained to a wall for her own good. They used to call it 100 years. We call it a Tuesday.
So that is the story of a man worth 9 copper and a woman who spent 81 years on a cellar floor. What I keep coming back to is that he never got a power. He had a habit from an ordinary job, and the only clever thing he did was refuse to keep it to himself. Every time somebody offered him the whole trade, he handed it to a girl from the vats instead. That is why it lasted. The other thing is shame. Nobody there ever passed a law saying, hide your mother in a hole. They all just agreed to be embarrassed, and it cost them 1,200 years and a woman under the floor. So when something in your life gets called private, ask who that protects and who pays for it in the dark.